the strangling pattern that normalized child abuse. In what represents one of the longest-running depictions of child abuse in television history, Homer Simpson has strangled his 10-year-old son, Bart, over 160 documented times throughout The Simpsons' run, transforming serious felony assault into comedic punctuation that audiences have learned to accept without question. The origins in Season 1. The strangling pattern makes its first appearance during The Simpsons' debut season, establishing what would become Homer's signature method of responding to Bart's misbehavior or disrespect. The initial strangling occurs without warning or build-up, introducing viewers to a dynamic where a father physically assaults his young son by wrapping both hands around the child's throat and shaking him violently while screaming threats. This first incident sets a template that the show would repeat hundreds of times over 3 decades, normalizing the image of parental violence to the point where it becomes expected rather than shocking. The choice to introduce strangling as Homer's primary disciplinary method, rather than spanking, yelling, or other forms of punishment, reveals something significant about the show's approach to violence. Strangulation represents one of the most dangerous forms of assault, capable of causing death, brain damage, or permanent injury within seconds when applied with genuine force. Yet the show presents this extreme violence as a running gag, using cartoon physics to eliminate realistic consequences, while maintaining the visual brutality of the act itself. The escalation pattern across 30 years. What begins as an occasional response to extreme provocations evolves into Homer's reflexive reaction to even minor annoyances from Bart. Analysis of strangling frequency across seasons reveals a disturbing escalation, with early seasons featuring perhaps 1 or 2 stranglings per season, while later seasons normalize the violence to the point where multiple episodes feature the act, sometimes occurring multiple times within a single episode. This frequency increase demonstrates how repeated exposure to violence breeds both creator and audience desensitization, making what was once shocking become mundane through sheer repetition. The escalation extends beyond frequency to intensity and duration. Early stranglings often last only a few seconds, functioning as brief punctuation to arguments. Later iterations show Homer maintaining his grip for extended periods, sometimes 10 to 15 seconds of screen time, with Bart's face turning purple, eyes bulging, and desperate gasping sounds, emphasizing the physical trauma being inflicted. This progression reveals how the normalization of violence creates pressure to escalate severity in order to maintain comedic impact, resulting in increasingly graphic depictions of child abuse disguised as humor. The physical mechanics of strangulation. Understanding the medical reality of strangulation makes The Simpsons' treatment of this violence particularly disturbing. In actual strangulation, pressure applied to the throat can collapse the trachea, cut off oxygen to the brain, damage the hyoid bone, and cause petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and face. Loss of consciousness can occur within 10 to 15 seconds, with brain damage following shortly after if pressure is maintained. Death can result from as little as 30 seconds of sustained strangulation pressure. The show's use of cartoon physics eliminates these realistic consequences entirely. Bart recovers instantly from each strangling with no visible injuries, breathing difficulties, or trauma responses. His neck shows no bruising, his voice remains unaffected, and he displays no fear of subsequent attacks, despite having been repeatedly subjected to near-death experiences. This complete disconnection from reality serves a specific function in the show's comedy, allowing the violence to exist as pure visual spectacle without the uncomfortable implications that realistic consequences would create. The psychological trauma accumulation. Despite the show's refusal to depict realistic physical consequences, the psychological implications of repeated strangulation cannot be ignored through analysis. Bart experiences over 160 separate incidents where his father wraps hands around his throat and applies potentially lethal force. In reality, a child subjected to even a single such incident would develop profound psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance around the attacking parent, and learned helplessness when unable to prevent or escape. Violence. The show occasionally hints at Bart's awareness of this pattern through his anticipatory flinching or attempts to flee when Homer becomes angry. These moments suggest that on some level, Bart has learned to predict when violence will occur and experiences fear responses consistent with ongoing abuse. However, these realistic reactions disappear within moments, replaced by the show's standard reset where characters remember nothing of previous trauma and respond to each incident as if it were completely novel rather than part of an established pattern of abuse. The triggering incident analysis. Examining what prompts Homer's strangulations reveals the complete absence of proportional response in his parenting approach. Homer strangles Bart for offences ranging from genuinely serious misbehaviour to trivial annoyances or even circumstances beyond Bart's control. Major triggers include Bart's pranks, disrespectful comments, poor grades, and general disobedience. However, Homer also strangles Bart for minor infractions like interrupting television viewing, making noise, or simply being present when Homer is frustrated about unrelated matters. This lack of proportionality demonstrates how Homer uses violence not as a disciplinary tool designed to correct specific behaviors, but rather as an emotional release valve for his own frustration and anger. The strangling serves Homer's psychological needs rather than Bart's developmental needs, transforming what should be parenting into a form of abuse where the child becomes a convenient target for adult emotional dysregulation. The fact that Homer's decision to strangle Bart appears to depend more on Homer's emotional state than Bart's actual behavior reveals the fundamentally abusive nature of this dynamic. The public setting assaults. Perhaps most disturbing is Homer's willingness to strangle Bart in front of witnesses, demonstrating complete absence of shame or awareness that his behavior constitutes criminal assault. Homer strangles Bart in public locations, including stores, restaurants, schools, and community gatherings, with bystanders typically watching without intervention or apparent concern. This public nature of the violence serves multiple functions in the show's universe, normalizing the abuse by presenting it as socially acceptable behavior that no one challenges or reports to authorities. The fact that other characters witness these strangulations without intervening reveals how completely the show's universe has normalized this violence. Teachers watch Homer strangle Bart on school property without calling child protective services. Police officers witness the assault without making arrests. Fellow parents observe the violence without expressing concern or attempting to protect the child. This complete social acceptance of public child abuse creates a fictional world where parental violence faces no external constraints, accountability, or consequences. The duration and intensity variation. The stranglings themselves vary significantly in duration and apparent force, ranging from brief 2 to 3 second grasps to extended sequences lasting 15 seconds or more of screen time. The longer sequences typically feature escalating visual indicators of distress, including Bart's face changing colour from normal to red to purple, his eyes bulging from pressure, his tongue protruding, and his limbs flailing as he attempts to break free from Homer's grip. These graphic details emphasize the violence being inflicted while maintaining the comedic framing through exaggerated cartoon physics. The intensity variations appear to correlate with the severity of Homer's anger rather than the seriousness of Bart's offense. Minor annoyances might prompt brief stranglings, while major infractions or moments when Homer is already frustrated about other matters result in prolonged, violent shaking combined with sustained pressure. This pattern reinforces how the strangling serves Homer's emotional needs rather than functioning as measured discipline proportional to the child's behavior. The violence escalates according to Homer's internal state rather than any rational assessment of appropriate parental response. The family's normalization response. Other family members display remarkable indifference to Homer's repeated strangulations of Bart, treating the violence as normal family interaction rather than serious assault requiring intervention. Marge occasionally offers mild verbal objections like asking Homer to stop, but never physically intervenes, calls police, or takes meaningful action to protect her son from ongoing abuse. Lisa witnesses the violence without showing appropriate alarm or attempting to help her brother. Even Maggie, the infant, appears desensitized to watching her father assault her brother repeatedly. This family-wide normalization demonstrates how abuse dynamics can become embedded in family systems, with each member learning their role in maintaining the pattern rather than disrupting it. Marge's failure to protect Bart reveals her complicity in the abuse pattern, prioritizing family stability and avoiding conflict with Homer over ensuring her children's safety. Lisa's lack of intervention suggests she has learned that questioning parental authority or attempting to help abuse victims carries risks she prefers to avoid. The entire family system has organized itself around accepting and accommodating Homer's violence, rather than challenging or stopping it. The complete absence of consequences. Throughout 30-plus years and 160-plus strangulations, Homer has never faced meaningful consequences for his repeated assaults on Bart. No one calls Child Protective Services to investigate the family. Police never arrest Homer for assault or domestic violence. Schools never ban Homer from campus or report the abuse to authorities. Doctors never notice signs of strangulation injuries during medical examinations. The legal system, social services, medical establishment, and educational institutions all fail completely to respond to ongoing child abuse occurring in plain view. This systematic failure of all protective systems serves a specific function in maintaining the Simpsons comedic universe, where consequences rarely persist beyond individual episodes and characters can engage in extreme behavior without facing realistic repercussions. However, this absence of consequences also normalizes a world where child abuse can occur openly without intervention, teaching audiences that parental violence exists in a protected category beyond accountability or legal constraint. The message becomes that fathers have unlimited right to physically assault their children without facing social or legal consequences. The trauma bonding cycle. The show occasionally depicts moments of affection or connection between Homer and Bart immediately following violence, creating a classic trauma bonding pattern where the abuser alternates between violence and affection to maintain psychological control over the victim. After strangling Bart, Homer might suddenly switch to friendly behavior, sharing activities or expressing love as if the violence never occurred. These rapid emotional shifts create confusion in abuse victims about whether the abuser is truly dangerous or loving, making it difficult to maintain consistent protective responses. This pattern mirrors real-world abuse dynamics, where abusers use intermittent positive reinforcement to maintain victims' attachment and hope for change. The victim learns that violence might be followed by affection, creating psychological investment in the relationship and making it harder to recognize the abuse pattern as systematic rather than occasional lapses in otherwise loving behavior. Bart's continued attachment to Homer, despite repeated violence, demonstrates how trauma bonding can maintain relationships that outside observers recognize as clearly abusive. The broader pattern of physical abuse. Strangulation represents only the most visible form of Homer's physical abuse toward Bart. The show depicts numerous other instances of violence, including slapping Bart across the face, throwing him bodily across rooms, shoving him into walls or furniture, and physically intimidating him through size and strength advantages. This broader pattern reveals that the strangling exists within a comprehensive system of physical abuse, where Homer uses violence as his primary tool for exerting parental authority and controlling Bart's behavior. The variety of abuse methods demonstrates that Homer's violence isn't limited to a single quirk or running gag, but rather represents a fundamental approach to parenting based on physical domination and fear. Each form of violence teaches Bart that his father's love is conditional on obedience, and that disobedience will be met with physical pain. This systematic use of violence creates an environment where the child must constantly monitor the parent's emotional state and modify behavior to avoid triggering attacks, placing responsibility for preventing violence on the victim rather than the perpetrator. The psychological justification mechanism. Homer's internal logic for strangling Bart, when revealed through dialogue or narrative framing, typically positions the violence as necessary discipline rather than abuse. Homer views himself as enforcing appropriate boundaries and teaching Bart lessons about respect, obedience, and consequences. This self-justification allows Homer to maintain his identity as a good father while engaging in behavior that objectively constitutes serious child abuse. The cognitive dissonance between his self-perception and his actions never resolves because the show's format prevents genuine character growth or recognition. This justification mechanism mirrors how real-world abusers rationalize their violence. By framing abuse as discipline, correction, or teaching moments, abusers avoid confronting the reality that they're harming vulnerable dependents for their own emotional gratification. The distinction between discipline and abuse lies in intent, proportionality, and harm caused. Discipline aims to teach better behavior through measured consequences appropriate to the offense, while abuse serves the emotional needs of the abuser through disproportionate violence that creates fear and trauma rather than learning. The parental authority corruption. Homer's use of strangulation represents a fundamental corruption of parental authority, transforming what should be protective guidance into violent domination. Parents possess legitimate authority over children based on their responsibility to ensure health, safety, and development toward independent adulthood. This authority includes setting boundaries, enforcing consequences, and teaching social rules. However, this legitimate authority becomes illegitimate when used to justify violence, exploitation, or harm. Homer's strangulations represent authority transformed into abuse, using the parent-child power differential to inflict violence that the child cannot escape or prevent. The show's presentation of this corrupted authority as comedic and normal teaches audiences to accept parental violence as a legitimate expression of family hierarchy. By positioning Homer's strangulations as reasonable responses to childhood misbehavior rather than criminal assault, the show reinforces cultural beliefs that children exist as property of parents who possess unlimited right to physical punishment. This message contradicts decades of child development research demonstrating that physical punishment produces worse behavioral outcomes than non-violent discipline methods and creates lasting psychological harm. The impact on Bart's development. Despite the show's refusal to depict realistic consequences, analysis of Bart's character reveals personality traits consistent with someone raised in an environment of unpredictable violence and conditional love. Bart displays difficulty trusting authority figures, engages in attention-seeking misbehavior, shows poor impulse control, and struggles with emotional regulation. While the show frames these traits as inherent to Bart's personality rather than consequences of his home environment, they align perfectly with documented effects of childhood abuse and neglect on psychological development. Children raised with physical abuse often develop hypervigilance, aggression, difficulty forming secure attachments, and problems with emotional regulation as their developing brains adapt to environments where violence is unpredictable and inescapable. Bart's constant pranking and rule-breaking might represent attempts to exert control in a life where he cannot control when his father will assault him. His difficulty connecting emotionally with others mirrors how abuse victims learn to protect themselves through emotional distance. The fact that the show never acknowledges these connections doesn't eliminate them from critical analysis of the family dynamics being portrayed. The cultural impact and audience desensitization. The Simpsons' treatment of Homer strangling Bart has had measurable cultural impact, with the image becoming iconic enough to be referenced in other media, parodied in various contexts, and even recreated in real-world situations by fans. This cultural penetration demonstrates how repeatedly exposing audiences to images of child abuse framed as comedy creates acceptance and normalization. What should shock or disturb becomes familiar and expected, with audiences trained to laugh at violence rather than recognize it as abuse worthy of intervention or concern. This desensitization effect extends beyond entertainment into real-world attitudes about parental violence. By presenting strangulation as a normal, acceptable response to childhood misbehavior, the show contributes to cultural beliefs that physical punishment is legitimate parenting rather than abuse. Research on media effects demonstrates that repeated exposure to violence, especially violence framed as justified or comedic, reduces empathy for victims and increases acceptance of aggression as appropriate problem-solving. The Simpsons strangling gag, multiplied across millions of viewers over decades, has shaped cultural understanding of what constitutes acceptable parental behavior. The real-world implications comparison. Comparing The Simpsons cartoon strangulation to real-world child abuse cases reveals the enormous gap between comedy and reality that allows the show to maintain its framing. In actual child abuse cases involving strangulation, victims suffer physical injuries including crushed tracheas, damaged neck vertebrae, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and death. Survivors face lasting psychological trauma, including PTSD, difficulty forming trusting relationships, and increased risk of mental health disorders throughout life. Perpetrators face criminal prosecution, imprisonment, and permanent loss of parental rights. The show's elimination of all these realistic consequences through cartoon physics creates a sanitized version of violence where the visual brutality remains, but the actual harm disappears. This allows audiences to enjoy the spectacle of violence without confronting uncomfortable realities about what such violence actually means for victims. However, this sanitization also teaches audiences to disconnect images of violence from their real-world implications, potentially reducing recognition of actual abuse when it occurs in contexts not clearly marked as serious or criminal. The gap between cartoon and reality serves the show's comedy while potentially undermining real-world abuse recognition and intervention. The pattern's persistence despite criticism. Despite occasional public criticism of the strangling gag and its normalization of child abuse, The Simpsons has maintained this element of Homer's character across its entire run. Network executives, show creators, and writers have defended the violence as cartoon comedy not meant to be taken seriously, arguing that cartoon physics eliminate any realistic implication of harm. This defense ignores how media shapes cultural attitudes and how repeated exposure to images, even obviously unrealistic ones, influences beliefs about acceptable behavior and social norms. The decision to persist with the strangling gag despite criticism reveals priorities in entertainment production, where established comedic formulas and character traits resist change even when their implications become problematic. Homer strangling Bart has become part of the show's identity, a recognizable element that audiences expect and that defines the character. Eliminating this element would require acknowledging its problematic nature and admitting that the show has been normalizing child abuse for decades, a recognition that would undermine the comedy and create uncomfortable questions about responsibility for cultural impact. Summary: in the strangling pattern that has defined Homer's relationship with Bart for over 3 decades, Homer's repeated physical strangulation of his 10-year-old son represents normalized child abuse disguised as comedy through cartoon physics and laugh track conditioning. The frequency and severity of these assaults, occurring over 160 documented times in both private and public settings without intervention, consequences, or realistic physical damage, demonstrates television's capacity to desensitize audiences to serious violence against children when framed as humor. The absence of lasting injury, trauma response, or behavioral change in Bart's character reveals how the show prioritizes comedic continuity over realistic portrayal of abuse consequences, creating cultural acceptance of parental violence that would result in immediate child protective services, intervention, and criminal prosecution in any real-world scenario. The pattern persists despite criticism because it has become embedded in the show's identity, with creators defending cartoon violence as harmless, while ignoring how repeated exposure to images of parental assault shapes cultural beliefs about acceptable discipline and legitimate parental authority. The strangling gag's cultural penetration and iconic status demonstrates how entertainment media can normalize serious abuse through repetition and comedic framing, teaching audiences to laugh at violence rather than recognize it as criminal behavior, requiring intervention to protect vulnerable victims from ongoing harm. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Homer's Enemy. Homer's Enemy, the systematic psychological destruction of Frank Grimes. The episode Homer's Enemy represents The Simpsons' darkest commentary on American meritocracy, showing how Homer's oblivious incompetence and completely unearned success drive a competent, hard-working man to insanity and electrocution, death within days of meeting him. The introduction of Frank Grimes. Frank Grimes enters the Springfield nuclear power plant as Mr. Burns' new hire, specifically chosen because his life story moved Burns to tears during a television profile. According to the episode's backstory, Frank was orphaned at age 4 when a silo explosion killed his parents. He spent his childhood as a delivery boy, working to support himself while attending school. At 18, he was severely injured in a silo explosion that left him requiring 4 years of painful physical therapy to regain basic motor functions. Throughout this ordeal, Frank put himself through night school and correspondence courses, earning his nuclear engineering degree through sheer determination and sacrifice. This background establishes Frank as the embodiment of American bootstrap mythology, someone who overcame every conceivable obstacle through hard work and personal responsibility. His achievements resulted entirely from his own efforts rather than family wealth, social connections, or inherited advantages. Frank represents what society claims to value most, the self-made individual who earns success through merit and perseverance. His story positions him as deserving of recognition, respect, and reward for extraordinary dedication to improvement despite circumstances designed to crush hope and ambition. The contrast in life circumstances. Frank Grimes' first encounters with Homer Simpson reveal a life gap so vast it defies comprehension. Homer occupies a comfortable middle-class existence, despite possessing no qualifications, skills, or work ethic that would justify such comfort. He owns a large home in a pleasant neighborhood, supports a family of 5 on a single income, enjoys job security despite catastrophic incompetence, and has experienced opportunities ranging from space travel to Grammy Award ceremonies. These achievements occurred not through effort or merit, but through accidents, connections, and the universe's apparent determination to reward Homer's existence regardless of his actions. The injustice of this disparity becomes immediately apparent when Frank observes Homer's daily behavior at the power plant. Homer sleeps at his workstation, eats constantly, demonstrates complete ignorance of basic nuclear safety procedures, and creates dangerous situations through negligence and stupidity. Yet Homer maintains secure employment with benefits sufficient to support his family comfortably. Frank, meanwhile, possesses actual expertise in nuclear engineering, works diligently, follows all safety protocols, and demonstrates genuine competence. The reward for Frank's superior qualifications and work ethic is a starting position with no guarantee of advancement or recognition. The workplace competence gap. The disparity between Frank's competence and Homer's incompetence creates constant cognitive dissonance for Frank as he attempts to reconcile meritocracy mythology with observed reality. Homer cannot identify his own workstation without assistance. He stores food in dangerous locations near radioactive materials. He falls asleep during critical operations. He treats the nuclear power plant as a place to avoid work, rather than a professional environment requiring expertise and attention. Each of these failures should result in immediate termination, yet Homer faces no consequences whatsoever. Frank's expertise makes Homer's incompetence even more glaring through direct comparison. Frank understands nuclear physics, safety protocols, and plant operations at a sophisticated level earned through years of study. Homer possesses no understanding of any aspect of his job beyond the basic fact that he works at the plant. When Frank attempts to explain technical matters to Homer, his explanations encounter not just ignorance, but aggressive indifference. Homer doesn't simply lack knowledge, he actively resists acquiring it, viewing Frank's competence as annoying rather than admirable, the initial friendly approach failure. Frank initially attempts to befriend Homer despite recognizing his incompetence, perhaps believing that personal connection might reveal redeeming qualities not apparent in professional settings. Frank invites Homer to lunch, makes friendly conversation, and tries to overlook Homer's obvious deficiencies. This approach reflects Frank's fundamental decency and his attempt to see the best in others, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Frank wants to believe that Homer must possess some hidden depths or admirable qualities that justify his comfortable life. However, every interaction between them reinforces Frank's growing horror at Homer's complete lack of awareness, ambition, or concern about his own incompetence. Homer treats Frank's friendliness as an opportunity to exploit him for free food or entertainment rather than genuine connection. Homer demonstrates no curiosity about Frank's background, no interest in his expertise, and no recognition that Frank's attempts at friendship represent generosity given their vastly different work ethics and capabilities. The friendship Frank offers is met with Homer's characteristic oblivious self-centeredness, the accumulating grievances. Each day, working alongside Homer adds new wounds to Frank's psyche as he witnesses the continued cosmic injustice of Homer's undeserved success. Frank watches Homer receive a phone call from former President Bush inviting him to social events, evidence of opportunities that should never have been available to someone of Homer's caliber. He observes co-workers treating Homer with familiarity and acceptance despite his dangerous incompetence. He sees management overlook Homer's failures while scrutinizing Frank's every action to verify he meets the standards Homer routinely violates without consequence. These accumulating observations create psychological pressure in Frank that builds toward inevitable rupture. Each incident by itself might be dismissed as anomaly or accident, but the pattern of unearned reward flowing consistently toward Homer while Frank's merit goes unrecognized creates a reality so fundamentally unjust that Frank's rational mind struggles to process it. The cognitive dissonance between what Frank believes should happen in a merit-based society and what actually happens in Homer's presence becomes unbearable. The family dinner humiliation. The breaking point begins when Homer invites Frank to dinner at the Simpson home, an invitation Frank accepts despite his growing antipathy because professional courtesy demands politeness to co-workers. This dinner proves catastrophic for Frank's already fragile acceptance of Homer's undeserved life. The Simpson home, rather than being the modest dwelling someone of Homer's competence might afford, turns out to be a spacious, comfortable house far beyond what Frank himself could hope to own, despite his superior qualifications and work ethic. The house tour Homer provides becomes a catalogue of undeserved achievements and inexplicable successes. Homer shows Frank a Grammy Award sitting casually on a shelf, evidence that Homer somehow won music industry recognition, despite having no musical talent or involvement in music production. Photographs on the wall show Homer in astronaut gear, revealing that this incompetent fool actually traveled to space through a NASA program. The basement contains exercise equipment, a well-stocked bar, and recreational facilities suggesting disposable income that should not exist for someone of Homer's earning capacity and family size. The house tour as torture. Each new revelation during the tour strikes Frank like a physical blow as his mind attempts to reconcile Homer's life with any theory of justice, fairness, or meritocracy. The Grammy represents achievements in a field where Homer possesses no expertise. The space travel photographs represent opportunities reserved for highly trained specialists, not nuclear plant safety inspectors who sleep at their workstations. The comfortable home itself represents financial security that Frank's lifetime of struggle has never approached despite his vastly superior work ethic and qualifications. Frank's visible distress during this tour goes unnoticed by Homer, who narrates his life's highlights with characteristic obliviousness to how each achievement represents cosmic injustice to someone who has worked infinitely harder for infinitely less. Homer's pride in these accomplishments, none of which he earned through merit or effort, creates a grotesque spectacle of privilege unconscious of itself. The fact that Homer genuinely believes he deserves these rewards makes the situation even more unbearable for Frank than if Homer were deliberately boasting. The breaking point progression. Following the dinner, Frank's mental state deteriorates rapidly as he can no longer maintain the psychological compartmentalization necessary to function in a world where Homer's existence is possible. Frank begins openly expressing his outrage at work, pointing out Homer's incompetence to anyone who will listen and demanding to know how such flagrant inadequacy can be rewarded while genuine merit goes unrecognized. His colleagues respond with confusion or dismissal, having long since accepted Homer as part of the workplace landscape, despite his obvious unsuitability for any position requiring competence or attention. The other workers' acceptance of Homer reveals how completely privilege and incompetence can be normalized when they operate within established systems. Homer has worked at the plant long enough that his presence feels natural, despite remaining fundamentally unsuitable for his position. Frank's outrage at this situation marks him as the outsider, the one unable to accept obvious injustice, rather than Homer being recognized as the problem. This social dynamic places Frank in the impossible position of appearing unreasonable for having reasonable reactions to genuinely unreasonable circumstances, the mimicry and mockery. Frank's psychological breakdown culminates when he decides to prove his point about Homer's undeserved success through public demonstration. During his lunch break, Frank begins imitating Homer's behavior in exaggerated fashion, announcing to gathered co-workers that he will now behave exactly as Homer does to see if he receives similar rewards. Frank slouches stupidly, speaks in Homer's voice, makes ignorant comments, and generally performs a savage parody of Homer's daily conduct. The mimicry is meant to force everyone watching to confront the absurdity they have normalized, to see Homer's behavior clearly when performed by someone else without the protective shield of familiarity. However, Frank's performance backfires catastrophically. Rather than recognizing the truth of Frank's critique, co-workers laugh at him as if he has lost his mind. The mimicry that should expose Homer's incompetence instead makes Frank appear unhinged and unprofessional. This response demonstrates how privilege operates through social consensus rather than objective standards. Homer's behavior is acceptable because everyone has agreed to accept it. Frank's identical behavior is unacceptable because he lacks the social capital and established position that makes Homer's incompetence tolerable to others. The electrocution death. Frank's breakdown reaches its fatal conclusion when he storms into the plant cafeteria and delivers an impassioned rant about Homer's undeserved success, culminating in Frank grabbing exposed electrical wires and electrocuting himself to death. The exact mechanism of death remains ambiguous in terms of intent. Frank might deliberately kill himself, unable to continue living in a world where merit means nothing and incompetence is rewarded. Alternatively, his complete psychological break might leave him unaware of danger, reaching for the wires while his mind has abandoned rational thought entirely. Regardless of intent, the responsibility for Frank's death lies squarely with the circumstances that drove him to this point. A competent, hard-working man, with every reason to expect success in a merit-based society, encounters irrefutable proof that merit means nothing compared to privilege, connection, and the universe's arbitrary distribution of rewards. This realization destroys Frank, because his entire life was built on the assumption that hard work and perseverance would eventually be rewarded. Confronting the reality that his suffering and sacrifice were pointless breaks something fundamental in his psyche that cannot be repaired. The funeral disrespect. Homer's behavior at Frank's funeral demonstrates his continued complete obliviousness to his role in this tragedy. During the service, Homer falls asleep and begins snoring loudly, disrupting the solemn occasion with his characteristic inability to show basic respect or awareness of social expectations. When Marge attempts to wake him, Homer's sleep-talking includes the phrase, "Change the channel, Marge," revealing that, even during a funeral for a man he drove to death, Homer's mind remains focused on trivial entertainment concerns rather than genuine grief or reflection. This final insult to Frank's memory encapsulates everything that made their relationship so toxic. Homer cannot even maintain consciousness during a funeral service, much less recognize his complicity in creating the circumstances that killed Frank. The other attendees respond to Homer's disruption with mild annoyance rather than the outrage such disrespect deserves, demonstrating once again how Homer's social position protects him from consequences that would destroy others. Frank's death changes nothing for Homer, who continues his comfortable, oblivious existence without learning any lessons or experiencing any growth. The complete absence of comprehension. Perhaps most disturbing about this entire tragedy is Homer's utter inability to understand what happened or his role in Frank's breakdown. Homer never grasps that his unearned privileges and rewards drove Frank to insanity. He never recognizes that their life disparities represented fundamental injustice. He never questions why a man with Frank's qualifications and work ethic would be so distressed by Homer's comfortable existence. The lessons that Frank's death should teach about privilege, merit, and justice are completely lost on Homer, who processes the entire incident as just another weird thing that happened at work. This absence of comprehension reveals the true horror of privilege operating unconsciously. Homer cannot recognize his advantages as advantages because he experiences them as normal and deserved. The idea that his life represents cosmic injustice to more deserving people never crosses his mind because such recognition would require self-awareness and empathy that Homer fundamentally lacks. His ignorance protects him from guilt while ensuring that nothing will ever change about the systemic inequalities that his existence represents. The systemic critique revealed. The episode's true target extends beyond Homer as an individual to indict entire systems that reward privilege over merit. Mr. Burns initially hires Frank because his story moved Burns emotionally, yet Burns does nothing to ensure Frank receives recognition or advancement commensurate with his abilities. The human resources system places Frank in a starting position alongside workers far less qualified. The workplace culture accepts Homer's incompetence as normal, while treating Frank's competence as unremarkable. Every system that should recognize and reward merit instead operates to maintain existing privileges and hierarchies. This systemic failure means that Frank's tragedy was inevitable, from the moment he entered an environment where Homer's comfortable mediocrity was already established and protected. No amount of hard work, competence, or dedication could overcome the structural advantages Homer enjoys through circumstantial luck and social acceptance. The episode suggests that American meritocracy is mythology rather than reality, with success depending more on birth circumstances and arbitrary advantages than on individual merit or effort. The tragedy of wasted potential. Frank Grimes dies having achieved almost nothing, despite possessing everything society claims to value. His intelligence, work ethic, and determination never translate into security, comfort, or recognition. The potential he represented, what he could have accomplished with even a fraction of Homer's unearned advantages, dies with him. His death eliminates someone who could have contributed meaningfully to society, while Homer continues occupying space and resources despite contributing nothing but incompetence and danger. This waste extends beyond Frank's individual potential to represent broader societal failure to identify and reward genuine talent. Every Frank Grimes who watches less qualified people succeed, while their own merit goes unrecognized, represents potential lost to frustration, despair, and abandonment of systems that promised fairness but delivered injustice. The cumulative effect of this waste diminishes society's capacity for progress while rewarding mediocrity and incompetence through self-perpetuating privilege structures. Summary. In Homer's Enemy, Homer's complete incompetence and unearned success, including owning a house, raising a family, traveling to space and winning a Grammy despite being functionally illiterate and catastrophically dangerous at his job, drive Frank Grimes to psychological breakdown and death through electrocution within days of meeting him. Homer's oblivious parading of his privileged life in front of a man who struggled his entire existence for basic survival demonstrates how systemic advantage operates as a form of violence against those who play by the rules and work for their achievements. The funeral scene, where Homer sleeps through Frank's service while disrupting it with snoring, reveals his complete inability to comprehend the destruction he causes, making him dangerous precisely because his harm operates through ignorance and privilege rather than conscious malice, leaving victims with no recourse for justice or recognition. Frank's death represents the inevitable outcome when merit-based mythology collides with privilege-based reality, destroying those who believed in systems that never existed while rewarding those too oblivious to recognize their advantages as advantages rather than deserved outcomes of their character and effort. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Colonel Homer. Colonel Homer, the emotional affair that crushed Marge's dignity. When Homer becomes manager for country singer Lurleen Lumpkin and begins an emotional affair that plays out publicly across Springfield, his complete dismissal of Marge's legitimate concerns and needs represents psychological cruelty that nearly destroys their marriage while providing him with ego gratification he values more than his wife's emotional well-being. The initial bar encounter. Homer's relationship with Lurleen begins when he storms out of a movie theatre after Marge shushes him during a film, deciding to drive aimlessly rather than return home and face his embarrassment. This impulsive flight from minor conflict reveals Homer's inability to process negative emotions without escalating situations into dramatic exits. His wounded ego from being corrected in public becomes justification for abandoning his family at the theatre and disappearing without explanation. During this aimless driving, Homer stops at a rural bar where Lurleen Lumpkin performs country music to a sparse crowd. Lurleen's performance immediately captivates Homer, not because of exceptional musical talent, but because she provides what his ego desperately craves: unconditional positive attention from an attractive woman. Her songs speak to feelings of being misunderstood and underappreciated, themes that resonate with Homer's perpetual sense that life treats him unfairly despite his objective advantages. The connection Homer feels is less about Lurleen as a person and more about how her presence makes him feel important, desired, and validated in ways his actual life supposedly fails to provide. The manager role assumption. Rather than enjoying Lurleen's performance and returning home to his family, Homer decides that Lurleen represents undiscovered talent requiring his managerial expertise to achieve success. This decision has nothing to do with Homer's actual capabilities in music management, which are non-existent, and everything to do with his need to position himself as important in Lurleen's life. By becoming her manager, Homer creates a legitimate reason for continued contact while positioning himself as her benefactor and guide, someone without whom her success would be impossible. Homer's enthusiasm for managing Lurleen stems entirely from ego gratification rather than genuine business acumen or concern for her career. He enjoys being the person Lurleen depends on, the man whose vision will transform her from bar performer to star. This fantasy allows Homer to see himself as powerful, competent, and necessary, a stark contrast to his actual workplace, where his incompetence is barely tolerated, and his family life, where his presence often creates problems rather than solving them. The manager role gives Homer significance he cannot achieve through his actual accomplishments. The song lyrics directly about Homer. Lurline's subsequent compositions make explicit what Homer either cannot or will not recognize. Her attraction to him is romantic, and her music is designed to communicate this attraction while maintaining plausible deniability. Songs with titles like Your Wife Don't Understand You contain lyrics that speak directly to Homer about his marital situation, positioning Marge as an obstacle to his happiness and Lurline as the understanding woman who truly appreciates him. These songs function as public declarations of romantic intent disguised as general country music themes. The fact that Homer appears genuinely oblivious to these obvious signals reveals either spectacular ignorance or willful blindness. Songs explicitly about his wife not understanding him, performed by a woman who spends increasing amounts of time alone with him, contain messages that any reasonable person would recognize as romantic overtures. Homer's failure to acknowledge what Lurline is communicating suggests that on some level he does understand, but chooses not to consciously recognize it, because acknowledging Lurline's intentions would require making explicit choices about his marriage that he prefers to avoid. The dismissal of Marge's concerns. When Marge expresses discomfort about Homer's relationship with Lurline, Homer responds with classic gaslighting techniques that reframe Marge's legitimate concerns as character flaws requiring correction. He accuses her of jealousy, suggesting that her discomfort stems from irrational insecurity rather than reasonable response to her husband's obviously inappropriate relationship with another woman. He insists that his relationship with Lurline is purely professional, despite spending late nights alone with her, traveling together without family, and managing a career in an industry he knows nothing about. This dismissal of Marge's concerns serves multiple functions for Homer. It allows him to continue enjoying his emotional affair without explicitly acknowledging it as an affair, maintaining his self-image as a faithful husband while pursuing intimate emotional connection with another woman. It places responsibility for relationship problems on Marge rather than his own behavior, requiring her to overcome her jealousy rather than him establishing appropriate boundaries. It positions his needs for ego gratification as more important than Marge's need for security and respect within their marriage. The public humiliation element. Homer's relationship with Lurline plays out publicly across Springfield, with neighbors, co-workers, and friends witnessing his obvious emotional affair, while Marge suffers the social humiliation of everyone knowing her husband is pursuing another woman. Lurline performs her songs about Homer at public venues, where Springfield residents hear explicit references to Homer's marital situation and Lurline's position as the woman who understands him better than his wife. This public dimension transforms Homer's emotional affair from private betrayal into community spectacle, where Marge's humiliation is witnessed and discussed. The public nature of this affair amplifies the psychological damage to Marge exponentially. Private betrayal allows for privacy in processing and addressing relationship problems. Public betrayal requires managing not only the emotional pain of the affair itself, but also the social embarrassment of everyone knowing about the situation while it continues. Marge must face neighbors who have heard Lurline's songs, co-workers who ask about Homer's new business venture, and friends who carefully avoid discussing the elephant in every room. This social dimension adds layers of shame and isolation to the emotional pain of Homer's betrayal. The prioritization of ego over family. Homer's dedication to managing Lurline requires time and energy that should be directed toward his family. He spends evenings at Lurline's trailer discussing her career when he should be home with his children. He travels to promotional events and meetings instead of attending family activities. He invests emotional energy into Lurline's problems and dreams, while showing minimal interest in Marge's feelings or needs. This pattern reveals that Homer prioritizes his ego gratification over his family's well-being, choosing the excitement and validation of being Lurline's manager over the mundane responsibilities of being a present husband and father. The children suffer collateral damage from Homer's emotional affair, as his absence and preoccupation creates instability in their home environment. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie witness their mother's distress while their father disappears to spend time with another woman. They observe the tension between their parents and the community gossip about their father's behavior. This exposure to adult relationship dysfunction creates anxiety and confusion for children who need stability and security rather than drama and uncertainty about whether their parents' marriage will survive. The isolation of Marge. As Homer invests increasing time and attention into Lurleen, Marge finds herself isolated and alone with 3 children to care for without meaningful partnership or support from her husband. This isolation is both practical and emotional. Practically, Homer's absence means Marge handles all parenting responsibilities, household management, and family logistics without help. Emotionally, Homer's obvious emotional investment in another woman leaves Marge without the intimate partnership and connection that marriage is supposed to provide. Marge's isolation during this period demonstrates how emotional affairs damage spouses even when physical infidelity never occurs. The emotional energy, attention, and intimacy that should flow between married partners is instead directed toward the affair partner, leaving the spouse functionally abandoned while technically still married. Marge experiences the loneliness of being single while carrying the responsibilities of being married, receiving none of the benefits of partnership while bearing all of its burdens. The escalating intimacy. As Homer spends more time with Lurleen, their relationship deepens from professional association to genuine emotional connection. They share late-night conversations about dreams and fears. They develop inside jokes and shared references. They create a private world of 2 that excludes everyone else, including and especially Marge. This emotional intimacy represents the core betrayal of emotional affairs, the redirection of emotional investment from spouse to affair partner that constitutes unfaithfulness even without physical contact. Homer's emotional intimacy with Lurleen fulfills needs that he claims his marriage doesn't meet, but this comparison ignores how Homer has neglected investing in his actual marriage while pursuing this affair. Marriages require ongoing emotional investment, communication, and attention to maintain intimacy. Homer has withdrawn his emotional investment from Marge to redirect it toward Lurleen, then uses the resulting emotional distance in his marriage as justification for seeking intimacy elsewhere. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where neglecting the marriage makes the affair feel more fulfilling than the marriage being neglected. The trailer seduction scene. The affair approaches consummation when Lurleen invites Homer to her trailer late at night and makes explicit romantic overtures that cannot be misinterpreted as friendly affection. She confesses her feelings for him, her belief that they belong together, and her desire for their relationship to become physical and permanent. This confrontation forces Homer to acknowledge what he's been avoiding, that his relationship with Lurleen has been an emotional affair all along, and that continuing requires explicit choice to betray his marriage. Homer's response to this explicit seduction reveals the internal conflict between his ego's desire for validation and whatever loyalty remains toward his family. He appears genuinely tempted by Lurleen's offer, spending moments considering whether to leave his marriage for this woman who makes him feel special and important. The fact that Homer comes this close to physical consummation demonstrates that his emotional affair was always heading toward this outcome. That emotional betrayal creates momentum toward physical betrayal, and that Homer's denials to Marge about the nature of his relationship were either self-deception or deliberate lies. The breaking point confrontation. Marge reaches her limit when Homer's affair becomes too blatant to tolerate any longer. She confronts him with an ultimatum, demanding he choose between continuing his relationship with Lurleen or maintaining his marriage. This ultimatum represents Marge's final attempt to establish boundaries and protect herself from ongoing betrayal. The fact that this explicit choice becomes necessary reveals how far the affair has progressed and how completely Homer has prioritized his ego over his marriage. Marge's ultimatum places Homer in the impossible position he has been avoiding throughout his entire affair, being forced to choose explicitly rather than having both the ego gratification of the affair and the security of his marriage. The conflict demonstrates how affairs are fundamentally selfish, allowing the unfaithful partner to meet needs through multiple relationships, while spouses suffer the betrayal of having their partner's energy divided. Homer's difficulty making this choice reveals how much he has valued the affair, despite his protests that it was merely professional. The last-minute return decision. Homer ultimately chooses his marriage over his affair with Lurleen, but this choice comes only after he has already driven to her trailer, prepared to leave his family. The last-minute nature of his decision suggests that it results less from genuine loyalty to Marge and more from fear of change or recognition of the practical difficulties of abandoning his family for a new relationship. Homer's thought process during this decision remains largely opaque, leaving unclear whether he experiences genuine remorse for his betrayal or simply realizes that leaving would be too complicated and uncomfortable. The fact that Homer comes within moments of choosing to leave his marriage demonstrates that his affair represented genuine threat to his family, rather than harmless ego gratification. Marge's fears were completely justified, and her distress was appropriate response to real danger of abandonment. Homer's ultimate choice to return home does not erase the betrayal of the emotional affair or the fact that he prioritized another woman's attention over his wife's well-being for weeks or months. The marriage continues, but the trust has been shattered. The lack of real accountability. Homer's return home and decision to fire Lurleen as his client does not include genuine accountability for his emotional affair or meaningful efforts to repair the damage he has caused. He does not apologize sincerely to Marge for his betrayal, dismissing her concerns even after events prove them completely justified. He does not acknowledge the pain his behavior caused or take responsibility for his choices. He does not make concrete commitments to rebuild trust or address the underlying issues that made him vulnerable to an emotional affair. This absence of accountability means that while Homer technically chooses his marriage, he does not do the work necessary to heal the relationship or prevent similar betrayals in the future. Marge receives the bare minimum: Homer's physical presence in the home. She does not receive acknowledgement of harm, genuine remorse, or changes in behavior patterns that created conditions for the affair. The marriage continues in name, but the foundation of trust necessary for genuine partnership has been undermined without repair. The pattern across other episodes. Homer's emotional affair with Lurleen represents one instance of a recurring pattern where Homer's ego needs and desire for external validation lead him toward relationships that threaten his marriage. Similar dynamics appear in his attraction to co-worker Mindy Simmons, where he again develops intimate emotional connection with another woman while dismissing Marge's concerns as jealousy. These recurring near affairs demonstrate that Homer's betrayal with Lurleen stems from fundamental character issues rather than unique circumstances. This pattern suggests that Homer views marriage as something he is entitled to maintain while also pursuing ego gratification through relationships with other women who provide attention and validation his wife supposedly fails to provide. The recurring nature of these near affairs creates ongoing instability in the marriage, where Marge can never fully trust that Homer will prioritize their relationship when faced with attractive women who stroke his ego. The emotional burden of constant vigilance against her husband's wandering attention adds lasting damage to their partnership. The damage to Marge's self-worth. Homer's emotional affair and his dismissal of Marge's concerns throughout it inflicts lasting damage on her self-esteem and confidence. The implicit message throughout the affair is that Marge is inadequate, that another woman understands and appreciates Homer in ways Marge cannot, that Marge's jealousy and insecurity are character flaws rather than reasonable responses to betrayal. These messages undermine Marge's sense of worth, both as a partner and as a person, teaching her that her needs and feelings are less important than Homer's comfort and ego. The long-term psychological impact of this betrayal manifests in Marge's increasing acceptance of poor treatment from Homer in subsequent episodes. Having fought for her marriage and barely won against an emotional affair, Marge learns that her threshold for acceptable behaviour must be very low if she wants to maintain her family. This learned tolerance for disrespect and dismissal creates a relationship dynamic where Homer faces minimal consequences for behaviour that should be unacceptable, knowing that Marge will ultimately tolerate almost anything to preserve the family. Structure. Summary. In Colonel Homer, Homer's emotional affair with Lurleen Lumpkin demonstrates his willingness to prioritize ego gratification over his wife's emotional well-being, dismissing Marge's legitimate concerns about their relationship as jealous overreaction, while the entire town watches his inappropriate intimate connection develop with another woman. His response to Marge's pain, continuing to tour with Lurleen, spending nights in her trailer, and allowing her to write and perform love songs explicitly about him, represents psychological cruelty that leaves lasting damage even after he returns home. The fact that Homer comes within moments of physical consummation before choosing his family reveals how close he repeatedly comes to destroying everything, forcing Marge to live in constant uncertainty about whether his next temptation will be the one that finally breaks their marriage permanently. His failure to provide genuine accountability, acknowledgement of harm, or meaningful behavior changes means that while he technically chooses his marriage, he does not do the work necessary to repair the trust he destroyed, leaving Marge with physical presence but not genuine partnership. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Homer versus Patty and Selma. Homer versus Patty and Selma. Financial desperation breeding systematic humiliation. When Homer's failed Pumpkin Futures investment forces him to borrow money from Marge's sisters rather than confess his mistake to his wife, he subjects himself to months of calculated psychological torture that demonstrates how financial control becomes a weapon for sadistic abuse. The failed investment scheme. Homer's financial crisis begins with his decision to invest the family's savings in pumpkin futures based on superficial understanding of how commodity markets operate. His investment strategy rests on the assumption that pumpkin prices will rise dramatically before Halloween due to seasonal demand for jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkin pie. This logic contains a fatal flaw that anyone with actual market knowledge would recognize immediately. Pumpkin demand peaks before Halloween, not after, meaning prices collapse the moment the holiday passes and demand evaporates entirely. Homer's investment timing demonstrates catastrophic financial illiteracy combined with overconfidence in his own cleverness. He purchases pumpkin futures, expecting to sell them at inflated Halloween prices, but delays selling until after the holiday passes, apparently believing demand would continue or increase. Instead, pumpkin prices collapse instantly on November 1st as stores desperately clear inventory of a product that no longer has any market. Homer's investment becomes worthless within hours, transforming the family's savings into massive debt that threatens their financial stability and ability to pay basic bills. The mounting financial crisis. The immediate aftermath of Homer's investment failure creates cascading financial emergencies as bills come due without funds to pay them. The mortgage payment faces default. Utility companies threaten service disconnection. Credit card debt accumulates interest charges. The family needs groceries, children need school supplies, and basic household expenses continue regardless of the investment disaster. Homer faces a rapidly closing window to address the crisis before consequences escalate from financial stress to actual material deprivation, affecting his family's quality of life. This mounting pressure should motivate Homer to confess his mistake to Marge, explain what happened, and work together to address the financial emergency through legitimate means, like bank loans, payment plans, or temporary sacrifices. Instead, Homer's shame about his foolish investment and fear of Marge's anger paralyze him into making progressively worse decisions designed to hide the problem rather than solve it. This psychological inability to face consequences directly leads him toward the abusive situation that follows. The decision to hide truth from Marge. Rather than confessing his investment failure and facing Marge's justified anger, Homer decides that maintaining his deception is more important than securing help from his life partner or protecting himself from exploitation. This choice reveals Homer's priorities. Preserving his ego and avoiding uncomfortable conversations matters more than his own well-being or financial security. Homer would rather subject himself to abuse from people who hate him than admit mistakes to the woman who presumably loves him and would ultimately help him address the crisis. This decision to prioritize ego over safety demonstrates how shame can trap people in abusive situations. Homer knows that borrowing from Patty and Selma will be unpleasant given their open contempt for him, but he cannot imagine a scenario worse than confessing to Marge. His inability to tolerate temporary discomfort of honest conversation leads him toward ongoing torture that will prove infinitely more damaging than the confession he fears. The choice illustrates how short-term thinking about emotional discomfort can lead to long-term consequences far more severe than the immediate pain being avoided. The borrowing from enemies. Homer's decision to borrow money specifically from Patty and Selma represents seeking help from the people most likely to exploit his vulnerability and least likely to show mercy or compassion during repayment. Patty and Selma make no secret of their contempt for Homer, viewing him as an incompetent oaf unworthy of their sister. They delight in his failures and actively wish for his marriage to end so Marge can do better. These women are not neutral lenders, they're enemies who will relish the opportunity to exercise power over someone they despise. Homer's choice to approach them despite knowing their hatred demonstrates his desperation, and also his fundamental miscalculation about relative costs. He imagines that dealing with Patty and Selma temporarily will be less painful than facing Marge's anger permanently. However, this calculation fails to account for how enemies will exploit power when given opportunity, transforming what should be a simple loan into an ongoing abuse dynamic that extracts psychological payment far exceeding the financial debt. The contract and terms of servitude. The loan agreement Patty and Selma present to Homer formalizes their intent to extract maximum suffering in exchange for financial assistance. Rather than offering a simple loan with interest and repayment schedule, they structure the arrangement to grant themselves control over Homer's time, labor, and dignity. The contract likely includes provisions requiring Homer to provide personal services, submit to their commands, and maintain absolute secrecy about the loan's existence. These terms transform a financial transaction into a power exchange where Homer becomes their servant. The formalization of abuse through written contract adds a layer of calculated cruelty to their exploitation. Patty and Selma recognize an opportunity not just to collect interest on money lent, but to exercise sadistic control over someone they hate, while he lacks any ability to resist or escape. The contract ensures Homer cannot later claim misunderstanding or refuse their demands without facing exposure of his financial fraud to Marge. This leveraging of shame and secrecy to maintain control over a victim represents classic abuse dynamics formalized through legal documentation. The systematic humiliation campaign. Once the loan is formalized, Patty and Selma begin a campaign of deliberate humiliation designed to extract maximum psychological pain from Homer's vulnerability. They demand he perform degrading personal services, including pedicures, foot massages, and other intimate grooming tasks that force Homer into subservient physical contact with people he finds repulsive. These demands serve no legitimate purpose related to loan repayment. They exist purely to humiliate and demonstrate power over someone helpless to refuse. The specific nature of these demands reveals sadistic intent behind the abuse. Patty and Selma choose tasks that maximize Homer's discomfort and degradation rather than selecting useful services they genuinely need. The foot-related demands force Homer into positions of physical servitude while performing tasks associated with lower status service workers, compounding his humiliation with class-based degradation. Each demand communicates their contempt while forcing Homer to demonstrate his powerlessness through physical submission to their will. The workplace harassment. Patty and Selma extend their abuse beyond private settings into Homer's workplace, demonstrating their intent to damage his professional reputation and social standing in addition to his personal dignity. They appear at the nuclear plant during work hours to make demands, forcing Homer to interrupt his duties to serve them in front of co-workers. This public dimension of the abuse adds social humiliation to private degradation, ensuring that Homer's powerlessness is witnessed by colleagues whose respect he needs to maintain professional standing. The workplace harassment creates a hostile environment where Homer cannot escape his abusers, even during hours that should be protected from their control. The constant threat that Patty and Selma might appear at any moment demanding immediate servitude creates anxiety that prevents Homer from ever relaxing or focusing fully on his job. This erosion of workplace boundaries demonstrates how financial abuse can contaminate all aspects of a victim's life, eliminating any safe spaces where they might recover psychological equilibrium. The personal errands as punishment. Beyond the intimate personal services, Patty and Selma require Homer to serve as their personal driver, shopper, and general servant for any errands or tasks they want performed. These demands consume Homer's free time, preventing him from spending evenings and weekends with his family or engaging in activities that might provide relief from the ongoing abuse. The errands also cost Homer money for gas and wear on his vehicle, adding financial burden to the psychological costs of servitude. The errands serve multiple functions in the abuse dynamic. They demonstrate Patty and Selma's power to command Homer's time and labor for trivial purposes. They isolate Homer from his support system by consuming time he would normally spend with family or friends. They create ongoing contact between abuser and victim that maintains psychological pressure and prevents Homer from forgetting his subordinate status, even temporarily. Each errand reinforces the power hierarchy and communicates that Homer's time, money, and energy belong to them for the duration of the debt. The toll on Homer's psyche. The sustained abuse from Patty and Selma produces observable changes in Homer's mental health and demeanor. He becomes withdrawn, anxious, and depressed, carrying the weight of ongoing servitude and the constant threat of exposure if he fails to comply with their demands. The stress of living double lives, maintaining normal appearance for Marge while secretly serving her sisters, creates psychological fragmentation that manifests in difficulty concentrating, emotional volatility, and physical symptoms of chronic stress. Homer's deteriorating mental state reveals how abuse compounds over time rather than remaining static. Each new humiliation adds to accumulated psychological damage, creating a snowball effect where the victim's capacity to cope erodes progressively. The hopelessness of being trapped in an abuse situation with no clear end date produces despair that can become more damaging than any individual incident. Homer's visible suffering suggests that months of systematic humiliation have inflicted trauma that will persist even after the debt is formally resolved. The DMV examiner scene. Patty and Selma's employment at the Department of Motor Vehicles provides additional opportunities to abuse their power over Homer when he requires their services in their official capacity. Their ability to fail his driver's license renewal or make his interactions with government bureaucracy deliberately difficult adds another dimension of control beyond the personal servitude. This abuse of official authority for personal vendettas demonstrates how individuals in positions of institutional power can exploit that power to harm people they personally dislike. The DMV scenes reveal how abuse can operate through official channels and neutral systems when individuals with authority choose to weaponize their positions. Patty and Selma's willingness to abuse their government roles for personal satisfaction shows complete absence of professional ethics or boundaries separating their personal lives from their official duties. The fact that they can threaten Homer with official sanctions, in addition to private humiliation, demonstrates how powerlessness compounds when victims face abusers who control multiple aspects of their lives. The cigarette smoking incident. The abuse dynamic reaches its crisis point when Patty and Selma are caught smoking cigarettes in a prohibited area at the DMV, facing potential termination for violating workplace smoking policies. This incident creates a moral test for Homer. He can allow them to face consequences for their own policy violations, potentially freeing himself from their abuse through their job loss, or he can protect them despite their months of sadistic mistreatment. The fact that this constitutes a genuine dilemma reveals Homer's capacity for consideration, even toward people who have tortured him. Homer's decision to take the blame for the cigarette smoking, claiming the cigarettes belonged to him and that he was smoking in the prohibited area, represents an act of selfless protection toward his abusers. This choice has no logical explanation in self-interest terms. Protecting Patty and Selma gains Homer nothing tangible, and in fact perpetuates his vulnerability to their continued abuse, since they retain their jobs and power over him. The decision can only be understood as emerging from Homer's values about family protection, or his inability to stand by while others suffer consequences, even when those others have earned those consequences through their own choices. The motivation behind protection, Homer's willingness to sacrifice himself to protect Patty and Selma despite their abuse, reveals something about his character that the abuse itself obscures. On some level, Homer values family cohesion enough to protect even family members he has reason to hate. His recognition that Patty and Selma are Marge's sisters and that their job loss would distress Marge outweighs his justified anger about their treatment of him. This capacity for selflessness, in service of protecting his wife from pain, demonstrates that beneath Homer's many flaws lies some genuine love for Marge. Alternatively, Homer's protection might stem from his broader pattern of avoiding conflict and uncomfortable situations by accepting short-term personal damage rather than making waves. His inability to let Patty and Selma face earned consequences mirrors his earlier inability to confess his investment failure to Marge. Both choices prioritize avoiding immediate conflict over long-term well-being, suggesting that Homer's sacrifice is less noble than it might appear and more consistent with his general conflict avoidance. The sisters' response and continued contempt. Patty and Selma's reaction to Homer's sacrifice reveals the depth of their moral bankruptcy. Rather than expressing gratitude for his protection or recognizing that his selfless act demonstrates character they have refused to acknowledge, they continue treating him with contempt and dismissal. Their inability to recognize or appreciate genuine self-sacrifice shows that their hatred for Homer is not based on his actual character or choices, but rather on predetermined narratives they refuse to revise regardless of contradicting evidence. This continued contempt after Homer saves them demonstrates that abuse victims often receive nothing in return for their sacrifices and compliance. The hope that demonstrating worth or making sacrifices will earn recognition and improve treatment from abusers is a fantasy that keeps victims trapped. Abusers who are motivated by sadism and power rather than legitimate grievances will not be moved by evidence of their victim's value or by acts of kindness. Patty and Selma's unchanged attitude proves that Homer's months of servitude and his ultimate sacrifice were wasted on people psychologically incapable of growth or reciprocity, the unresolved financial trauma. The episode's resolution leaves Homer's financial situation ambiguous, with no clear indication whether the debt is forgiven, still outstanding, or simply forgotten by the show's episodic format. This lack of resolution means that Homer's financial irresponsibility that initiated the crisis goes unaddressed, setting up potential for similar disasters in the future. The broader lesson about managing money, seeking help from partners rather than enemies, and avoiding exploitation through transparency is lost because Homer never faces real accountability for his choices. The unresolved nature of the financial trauma also means that Homer retains vulnerability to similar exploitation in the future. If the debt remains outstanding, Patty and Selma can resume their abuse at any time. If the debt was forgiven, Homer learned that his willingness to be tortured indefinitely will eventually be rewarded, reinforcing the maladaptive coping strategy rather than teaching better approaches to financial and relationship problems. Either outcome fails to provide genuine resolution or growth. Summary: in Homer versus Patty and Selma, Homer's financial desperation forces him into months of systematic psychological torture at the hands of Marge's sisters, who exploit his vulnerability to humiliate and degrade him through demands for intimate personal services, workplace harassment, and consumption of his free time as their servant. His decision to take the blame for their cigarette smoking violation, protecting the very people who have been tormenting him daily, demonstrates his capacity for selfless sacrifice, even when recipients have shown him nothing but cruelty and contempt. The sisters' continued derision despite his sacrifice reveals how abuse victims often receive no gratitude, changed behavior, or acknowledgement from their tormentors, regardless of compliance or kindness, leaving Homer financially and psychologically scarred without resolution, healing, or any guarantee that similar exploitation won't occur again when future financial crises inevitably arise. The episode demonstrates how shame and fear of honest communication can trap people in abuse situations far worse than the discomfort of confession they sought to avoid, with Homer's choice to borrow from enemies rather than confess to his wife, creating months of torture that confession would have prevented entirely. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Homer Badman. Homer Badman, when reputation destruction becomes community sport. In what represents one of television's earliest examinations of media-driven accusation culture, Homer Simpson faces complete social annihilation over a gummy candy incident that spirals into a sexual harassment nightmare from which he cannot escape, and, despite his actual innocence, demonstrating how quickly accusation becomes conviction, regardless of evidence or truth. The Candy Festival and Acquisition. Homer's ordeal begins at a candy industry exposition where he becomes obsessed with a rare collectible item, a gummy Venus de Milo, a candy sculpture of the famous armless statue cast in translucent gummy material. This obsession with acquiring the candy drives Homer's behavior throughout the evening, overriding his attention to other responsibilities, including supervising his children and maintaining appropriate social boundaries. When Homer finally obtains the gummy Venus by stealing it from a display, his focus narrows entirely to protecting his prize from any threat of loss or damage. The intensity of Homer's fixation on this piece of candy reveals his tendency toward obsessive behavior when confronted with objects of desire. The gummy Venus becomes more important to Homer than maintaining appropriate conduct, following social rules, or considering how his behavior appears to others. This single-minded focus on immediate gratification at the expense of broader judgment creates the conditions for the misunderstanding that follows, as Homer's attention to the candy prevents him from recognizing how his actions might be perceived or misinterpreted. The babysitter ride-home incident. After the candy exposition, Homer and Marge give their babysitter Ashley a ride home, with Ashley sitting in the back seat. During the drive, the gummy Venus de Milo that Homer has been protecting all evening falls from his pocket and lands on Ashley's clothing, specifically attaching to the seat of her pants. Homer notices the candy's location and, without thinking through the implications or asking permission, reaches directly for the candy, grabbing it off Ashley's body. His hand makes contact with her rear end as he retrieves his prized gummy candy. From Homer's perspective, this action is entirely innocent and motivated solely by his desire to recover his stolen candy before it's lost. He sees the gummy Venus, he reaches for it, he retrieves it. The fact that the candy is attached to another person's body registers as an inconvenience rather than a boundary requiring negotiation. Homer's complete lack of awareness about how this action might be perceived or experienced by Ashley demonstrates his characteristic obliviousness to social norms and other people's perspectives. He cannot imagine that someone might interpret his candy retrieval as inappropriate touching because his own intent was entirely focused on the candy itself. the accusation and immediate guilt presumption. Ashley interprets Homer's grabbing as sexual assault, experiencing his touch as unwanted sexual contact rather than candy retrieval. Her perception of the incident is understandable from her perspective. An older man reached from the front seat and grabbed her rear end without warning, permission, or explanation. The fact that Homer was retrieving candy attached to her clothing is not visible to Ashley, who cannot see what Homer sees or know his motivations. From her viewpoint, she experienced unwanted touching that felt violating and frightening. Ashley's decision to report this incident as sexual harassment sets in motion a response mechanism that presumes guilt rather than investigating circumstances. The immediate social response treats Ashley's interpretation as definitive truth rather than one perspective requiring verification through evidence. Homer's explanation about retrieving candy is dismissed as an obvious lie, the kind of absurd excuse that guilty men invent to justify predatory behavior. The possibility that Homer's bizarre explanation might actually be true never receives serious consideration, because the explanation sounds exactly like something a guilty person would fabricate. The media circus feeding frenzy. News of the accusation spreads rapidly through Springfield, with local media treating Homer's alleged sexual harassment as a major scandal worthy of extensive coverage. The television news program Rock Bottom dedicates significant airtime to investigating and reporting on Homer's supposed predatory behavior, transforming a disputed incident involving two people into a community-wide spectacle. The media coverage emphasizes sensational aspects of the story while minimizing or ignoring evidence that might complicate the narrative of clear guilt. Rock Bottom's investigation includes interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances who are asked leading questions designed to elicit statements supporting the predetermined narrative of Homer as sexual predator. The editing of these interviews removes all context and nuance, creating a documentary that presents carefully selected moments as if they represent comprehensive truth. Statements that might exonerate Homer are cut from the broadcast, while ambiguous comments are edited to sound like damning evidence. This manipulation of footage demonstrates how media can construct guilt through selective presentation, regardless of underlying reality. The public shaming campaign. Following the Rock Bottom broadcast, Homer faces organized public shaming, including protesters gathering outside his home, carrying signs with slogans denouncing him as a pervert and demanding accountability. These protesters create a hostile environment where Homer's family cannot leave their house without facing verbal harassment and public condemnation. The protest transforms Homer's neighborhood from a safe domestic space into a zone of ongoing threat and humiliation, visible to everyone in the community. The protesters' certainty about Homer's guilt, despite having no first-hand knowledge of the incident, reveals how media narratives shape public opinion independent of evidence or truth. These people have never spoken to Homer, never investigated the circumstances, never considered alternative explanations. They have watched edited television coverage and accepted that coverage as complete truth, then organized to punish Homer based on media representation rather than factual investigation. Their certainty demonstrates how quickly accusation can solidify into conviction when media framing supports guilt presumption. The impact on family dynamics. The accusation and resulting public shaming creates severe stress within the Simpson family, as each member processes the situation differently. Marge struggles between her knowledge of Homer's character and the overwhelming social pressure to believe accusers. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie face harassment at school from classmates who have heard about their father's alleged behavior. The family's normal routines become impossible, as leaving the house means facing protesters and social ostracism. The children's exposure to accusations against their father creates particular trauma, as they lack the developmental capacity to process complex situations involving disputed interpretations of ambiguous events. Bart and Lisa hear classmates repeat media characterizations of their father as a pervert without understanding the nuances of what actually occurred, or the possibility that misunderstanding rather than malice explains the situation. This forces them to defend their father publicly, while privately questioning whether the accusations might be true, creating internal conflict that damages their sense of security about their family and their understanding of their father. The desperate attempts to prove innocence. Homer's efforts to clear his name consistently fail because the social narrative has already established his guilt as fact, making all defensive efforts appear as attempts to escape earned consequences rather than legitimate claims of innocence. When Homer explains that he was reaching for candy rather than inappropriately touching Ashley, this explanation is interpreted as an absurd lie rather than potential truth. His insistence on his innocence is reframed as refusal to take accountability rather than genuine claim of being falsely accused. This inability to prove innocence reveals a fundamental problem with accusation-based judgment systems. Proving a negative is essentially impossible, especially when the negative being proven is internal state or motivation. Homer cannot prove what he was thinking when he grabbed the candy because thoughts leave no physical evidence. He cannot demonstrate his innocent intent because intent exists only in his mind. The only evidence is the physical action itself, which can be interpreted as either innocent candy retrieval or sexual assault depending on assumptions about Homer's character and motivations. The physical toll manifestation. The sustained stress of being publicly accused, socially ostracized, and unable to clear his name produces visible, physical effects on Homer, including weight loss, insomnia, and general deterioration in health and appearance. The psychological burden of being falsely accused while helpless to prove innocence creates chronic stress that manifests in physical symptoms. Homer's deteriorating condition demonstrates how false accusations inflict genuine harm on accused individuals regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The physical toll also reflects the social isolation that accompanies public accusation. Friends and co-workers distance themselves from Homer to avoid association with someone accused of sexual misconduct, leaving him without social support systems that normally buffer against stress. This isolation compounds the psychological damage as Homer faces the crisis without the emotional resources that friendship and community provide. The combination of public condemnation and private isolation creates conditions that break down even resilient individuals. The mental health crisis. Homer's psychological state deteriorates as the accusations persist without resolution. He develops paranoia about how his actions will be interpreted, second-guessing every interaction and becoming hypervigilant about maintaining distance from situations that might be misunderstood. This hypervigilance creates exhausting cognitive load, as Homer must constantly monitor and manage his behavior in ways that never occurred to him before the accusation. The freedom of moving through the world without self-consciousness about every action is stripped away by awareness that any behavior might be reinterpreted as evidence of predatory nature. The paranoia extends beyond Homer's own actions to include suspicion about others' motivations and the security of his position in the community. Homer begins to recognize how quickly people he considered friends or allies abandoned him when accusation made him socially toxic. This recognition damages his capacity to trust others or feel secure in relationships, as he now understands that social acceptance is conditional and can be revoked instantly when someone becomes accused regardless of actual guilt. The mental health crisis created by false accusation persists even after formal vindication because the lessons learned about human nature and social dynamics cannot be unlearned. The private investigator hiring. In desperation to find evidence of his innocence, Homer hires groundskeeper Willie to serve as a private investigator, hoping that an objective investigation will uncover proof that exonerates him. This decision reveals Homer's faith that truth and evidence matter, that if he can just present the right proof, people will recognize his innocence and the nightmare will end. However, Willie's investigation produces no useful evidence because the incident occurred without witnesses, and the only physical evidence is the candy itself, which could plausibly be explained as either innocent motivation or convenient excuse. Willie's inability to find exonerating evidence demonstrates a crucial asymmetry in accusation dynamics. Guilt can potentially be proven through evidence, but innocence often cannot be proven because innocence is the absence of guilty action rather than presence of exonerating action. Homer needs evidence that he was thinking about candy rather than sexual assault when he grabbed Ashley, but thoughts cannot be recorded or verified after the fact. The absence of evidence proving guilt is not accepted as evidence of innocence. Instead, lack of proof is interpreted as indicating skilled cover-up rather than absence of wrongdoing. The lack of due process. Throughout Homer's ordeal, no formal legal proceedings or official investigations occur that might provide structure, rights, or procedural protections for the accused. The entire judgment and punishment process operates through informal social channels, where there are no rules of evidence, no right to face accusers, no presumption of innocence, and no opportunity for appeal or correction of error. This absence of due process means that Homer faces punishment without any of the protections that legal systems theoretically provide to prevent wrongful conviction. The informal nature of social judgment allows the accusation to function as conviction without requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt, opportunity for defense, or consideration of alternative explanations. The court of public opinion operates on different evidentiary standards than legal courts, accepting media representation and social consensus as sufficient basis for punishment. This creates situations where people can be destroyed socially while remaining innocent legally, facing all consequences of conviction without any protections that formal legal processes theoretically provide. The surveillance video discovery. Homer's vindication finally arrives when someone discovers security footage from the car showing the exact moment of the incident, with the video clearly showing the gummy Venus de Milo falling onto Ashley's pants and Homer reaching specifically for the visible candy rather than groping her body without cause. This footage provides objective evidence of Homer's innocent intent and accurate explanation, proving that his bizarre candy story was actually true rather than a fabricated excuse. The video's existence represents pure luck rather than guaranteed outcome of investigation, revealing how easily Homer could have remained permanently branded as sexual predator if the security camera had been positioned differently, or if the footage had been routinely erased before anyone thought to check it. The fact that Homer's vindication depends on fortunate circumstances rather than systematic investigation of truth demonstrates the precariousness of innocence when accused in the court of public opinion. Without the video, Homer would never have been able to prove his innocence, and the accusation would have defined his reputation permanently. The fleeting nature of exoneration. Despite the surveillance video providing clear and definitive proof of Homer's innocence, the public response to his exoneration proves minimal and fleeting compared to the sustained attention given to the original accusation. Rock bottom airs a brief correction acknowledging their error, but this correction receives a fraction of the airtime and promotional energy given to the original accusatory broadcast. Most people who saw the initial coverage never see the correction, meaning their understanding of Homer as guilty sexual predator remains unchanged by evidence of his innocence. This disparity between accusation coverage and exoneration coverage reveals systematic bias in media and public attention towards scandalous accusations over boring exonerations. Stories about guilt are inherently more interesting and emotionally engaging than stories about innocence, creating incentive structures where media organizations devote more resources to accusatory content than corrective content. The result is that false accusations spread widely, while corrections reach minimal audiences, leaving the majority of people with false beliefs about guilt that the minority who saw corrections cannot effectively counter. The lasting damage despite truth. Even after being formally vindicated through video evidence, Homer faces continued suspicion and social damage from people who either never learned about his exoneration or choose to maintain their initial interpretation despite contradicting evidence. Some people continue believing Homer is guilty because they trust their initial impression more than later correction. Others acknowledge the video evidence but maintain that his behavior was still inappropriate, even if not technically criminal. Still others simply never update their understanding because they moved on from the story before the exoneration aired. This persistence of guilt associations despite exoneration demonstrates how accusations create permanent damage that truth cannot fully repair. The initial accusation links Homer's name and reputation to sexual misconduct in ways that exoneration weakens but never completely eliminates. People who hear Homer Simpson now think, wasn't he accused of something? Even if they also know he was cleared. This residual guilt association damages Homer's reputation, employment prospects, and social standing for the rest of his life, regardless of his actual innocence. The psychological scarring permanence. The experience of being falsely accused and publicly destroyed before being vindicated creates lasting psychological trauma that persists long after formal exoneration. Homer develops permanent trust issues, hypervigilance about how his actions might be misinterpreted, and awareness that his reputation and social standing can be destroyed instantly based on misunderstanding or malicious accusation. This knowledge changes how Homer moves through the world, creating perpetual low-level anxiety about potential accusations that never existed before this incident. The trauma also includes recognition of how quickly friends, neighbors, and community members abandoned him when accusation made him socially toxic. Homer learned that people he considered friends were actually fair-weather allies, whose support was contingent on his social acceptability rather than based on genuine relationship or knowledge of his character. This lesson about human nature and social dynamics cannot be unlearned, leaving Homer with permanent reduced capacity for trust and social connection. The psychological scars from false accusation persist as permanent damage to Homer's mental health and social functioning. The broader implications for accused. Homer's experience illustrates systematic problems with accusation-based social judgment that operates without evidence requirements, presumption of innocence, or opportunities for defense. The ease with which a single accusation destroyed Homer's reputation and social standing demonstrates vulnerability of all people to similar destruction, regardless of actual guilt. The fact that Homer's vindication required lucky existence of security footage shows that most falsely accused people will never be able to prove their innocence, facing permanent reputational damage for things they did not do. This vulnerability creates chilling effects on social interaction, as people recognize that any misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or malicious false accusation could destroy their lives permanently. The rational response to this vulnerability is hypervigilance and social withdrawal, avoiding situations or interactions that might be misunderstood or deliberately mischaracterized. However, this defensive approach damages social cohesion and human connection, as fear of accusation prevents genuine engagement with others. The system that empowers accusers by eliminating evidence requirements and presumption of innocence creates society-wide costs through erosion of trust and social connection. The media's role in mob formation. Rock Bottom's coverage of Homer's accusation demonstrates how media organizations can create and direct mob outrage through selective editing, leading questions, and narrative framing that presents guilt as established fact rather than disputed claim, requiring investigation. The media's power to shape public opinion carries responsibility to exercise that power carefully, with attention to truth and fairness. However, the incentive structures of media organizations reward sensational content over accurate content, creating systematic bias toward accusatory narratives that generate attention and engagement. The ease with which Rock Bottom manipulated public opinion against Homer shows the danger of trusting media narratives without independent verification. The protesters outside Homer's house believed they were acting righteously based on information from trusted media sources. But that information was deliberately constructed to support predetermined conclusions rather than present comprehensive truth. This manipulation of public opinion through selective media coverage represents a form of social violence where organizations with platform power can destroy individuals without accountability for accuracy or fairness in their reporting. Summary. In Homer Badman, Homer's innocent attempt to retrieve a gummy candy from the babysitter's pants transforms into complete destruction of his reputation through media distortion, public presumption of guilt, and mob shaming that continues despite complete absence of evidence supporting the accusation beyond initial interpretation of ambiguous action. The public campaign, including televised character assassination by Rock Bottom using selectively edited footage, home protests with signs calling him a pervert, and social ostracism affecting his entire family, demonstrates how quickly accusation becomes conviction in the court of public opinion, regardless of actual evidence, due process, or truth. Even after surveillance footage exonerates him completely, proving his innocence beyond any doubt by showing he was reaching for visible candy rather than groping. The damage to Homer's psychological well-being, family reputation, and community standing proves permanent and irreversible, showing how false accusations leave lasting scars even when proven baseless. The disparity between extensive accusation coverage and minimal exoneration coverage means most people retain false beliefs about Homer's guilt, while those who know the truth cannot fully repair the reputational damage, leaving Homer with permanent associations to sexual misconduct despite his actual innocence. The experience teaches Homer that his reputation can be destroyed instantly through misunderstanding or malicious accusation, creating lasting paranoia and social withdrawal that damages his capacity for trust and genuine human connection throughout the rest of his life. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the last exit to Springfield. Last exit to Springfield, when incompetence becomes labor negotiation. Homer Simpson's accidental ascension to union president during Mr. Burns' ruthless campaign to eliminate workers' dental benefits demonstrates how his complete ignorance of union dynamics, labor law, and negotiation strategy nearly results in catastrophic healthcare loss for every plant employee while he remains entirely focused on personal concerns about Lisa's braces. The dental plan elimination announcement. The crisis begins when Mr. Burns announces his intention to eliminate the dental plan from workers' benefits package, motivated by cost reduction and his general contempt for employee well-being. This elimination represents massive healthcare loss for workers who depend on dental coverage for their family's basic oral health needs. The timing of Burns' announcement during routine contract negotiations suggests calculated exploitation of bureaucratic process to slip major benefit cuts past workers who might not be paying attention to technical contract language. Burns' strategy reflects broader corporate approach to benefit reduction through gradual erosion rather than dramatic confrontation. By presenting dental plan elimination as routine contract adjustment rather than major benefit cut, Burns attempts to minimize worker resistance and union mobilization against the change. This strategy depends on worker apathy and inattention to contract details, assuming that most employees will not notice the elimination until it's already finalized and too late to reverse through collective action. Lisa's orthodontic crisis. The same day Burns announces dental plan elimination, Lisa discovers she needs extensive orthodontic work, including braces to correct serious dental misalignment. This orthodontic need suddenly makes dental coverage personally urgent for Homer rather than an abstract benefit he can ignore. Without dental insurance, the cost of Lisa's braces far exceeds what the Simpson family can afford, threatening Lisa with permanent dental problems that will affect her health, appearance, and self-confidence throughout her life. This personal crisis transforms Homer's relationship to the dental plan from abstract labor issue to immediate family emergency. Homer's motivation to preserve dental benefits stems entirely from self-interest regarding Lisa's needs, rather than solidarity with fellow workers or commitment to labor rights. This self-centered motivation makes Homer's eventual role as union president darkly ironic, as his defense of worker interests occurs accidentally through pursuing his personal family needs rather than through genuine labor, consciousness, or commitment to collective action. The union president vacancy. The union president position becomes vacant at this critical moment through the previous president's resignation, retirement, or removal. Homer attends the union meeting where a new president must be selected, but his attention focuses entirely on his personal dental crisis rather than the important union business being discussed. When someone nominates Homer for the presidency as a joke or through misunderstanding, Homer accepts without comprehending what the position entails or the responsibilities it carries. Homer's election to union president occurs through a perfect storm of worker apathy, accidental nomination, and Homer's own complete ignorance. Workers who should be paying attention to this crucial decision are distracted, disengaged, or simply don't care enough to prevent an obviously unsuitable candidate from assuming leadership. Homer's acceptance of nomination without understanding the position demonstrates his characteristic pattern of accepting opportunities without considering whether he possesses necessary qualifications or awareness of what he's agreeing to do. The negotiation incompetence. Homer's approach to negotiating with Mr. Burns reveals complete absence of strategy, preparation, or understanding of labor management dynamics. He enters negotiations without reviewing the contract, consulting with legal counsel, or establishing clear objectives for what the union wants to achieve. His responses to Burns' proposals are based on momentary impulses and personal confusion rather than calculated strategic positions. This incompetence should make Homer easy to manipulate and defeat in negotiations. However, Homer's incompetence creates an unexpected advantage. He is too ignorant to recognize when Burns is threatening or attempting to intimidate him. Burns' sophisticated manipulation tactics, refined through decades of crushing labor organizing, simply fail to register in Homer's mind as threats requiring surrender. Where a competent union president might recognize losing positions and strategically retreat, Homer continues making unreasonable demands because he genuinely does not understand that his position is weak or that Burns' patience is ending. The Burns intimidation tactics. Mr. Burns attempts various intimidation strategies designed to break Homer's resistance and force capitulation on the dental plan elimination. These tactics include veiled threats about job security, implications of plant closure, and suggestions that union intransigence will harm all workers. Burns' approach assumes that Homer possesses normal understanding of power dynamics and self-preservation instincts that make threats effective tools for gaining compliance. Burns' frustration mounts as his carefully calibrated threats fail to produce the expected cowering and surrender from Homer. Where previous union presidents recognized implicit threats and backed down accordingly, Homer responds to Burns' most menacing statements with blank incomprehension or non sequiturs that suggest he hasn't processed the threat at all. This inability to be intimidated stems not from courage or strategic calculation, but from genuine failure to understand that he is being threatened, making Homer accidentally immune to Burns' primary weapon, the accidental resistance. Homer's negotiating position hardens into what appears to be principled refusal to compromise on worker benefits, but this hardline stance results from confusion rather than strategic choice. Homer maintains demands for dental plan preservation not because he has calculated that this position will win, but because he literally does not understand that he has the option to accept Burns' elimination proposal. His insistence on keeping dental benefits looks like courage or strong labor consciousness, but actually represents his inability to process that negotiations involve give and take rather than simply stating what he wants. This accidental resistance frustrates Burns' expectations and forces him into positions he did not anticipate occupying. Burns prepared for negotiations with competent opponent who would recognize power dynamics and make strategic calculations about achievable goals. Instead, he faces an opponent who cannot be moved through rational argument or intimidation because that opponent lacks capacity to understand either approach. Homer's imperviousness to persuasion stems from cognitive limitations rather than strategic brilliance, but the effect is the same as if Homer were a masterful negotiator refusing to be swayed. The plant-wide implications. The negotiation's outcome will determine healthcare access for hundreds of families beyond the Simpsons, with the dental plan covering not just workers, but their spouses and children. The elimination would force these families to either pay out of pocket for dental care at costs many cannot afford, or forego necessary dental treatment with resulting health consequences. The stakes extend beyond financial impact to include basic health and well-being for an entire community of workers and their dependents. The other workers remain largely unaware of how precariously their dental coverage hangs on Homer's accidental resistance to Burns' demands. They go about their daily lives assuming the union president understands his role and is making informed strategic decisions about their benefits. The disconnect between workers' trust in their representation and the reality of Homer's ignorance creates dangerous vulnerability, where workers' futures depend entirely on luck and accident rather than competent advocacy. The family's dependence on resolution. Marge and the children become increasingly anxious as Lisa's dental condition worsens while Homer's negotiations drag on without resolution. Lisa experiences physical pain and psychological distress from her uncorrected dental problems, needing treatment that remains inaccessible until the dental plan's fate is determined. The family's dependence on Homer successfully preserving dental benefits adds personal pressure to the already high-stakes negotiations, though Homer remains largely oblivious to this pressure. The family dimension of the crisis reveals how labor negotiations that appear abstract and political actually determine real families' access to healthcare and quality of life. Lisa's suffering makes concrete what dental plan elimination means in human terms rather than budget line items. The disconnect between Burns' view of dental benefits as unnecessary expense and the Simpson family's experience of dental coverage as crucial protection illustrates the gap between management and worker perspectives on benefit value. The standoff and strike. When negotiations reach impasse, the union calls a strike, shutting down the power plant and creating confrontation between workers and management. The strike transforms abstract negotiation into visible conflict with picket lines, lost wages, and public attention. Homer continues as strike leader despite having no understanding of strike strategy, legal protections for striking workers, or how to build public support for the union position. His incompetence should doom the strike to failure through amateur mistakes and strategic errors. However, the strike succeeds despite Homer's incompetence because the underlying grievance resonates with workers and the timing creates pressure on Burns to settle. Workers understand that dental benefits matter regardless of their president's inability to articulate clear arguments for preservation. Burns faces political and economic pressures to end the strike that override his personal desire to crush the union. The strike's success occurs around Homer rather than because of him, with other factors determining the outcome, while Homer gets credit for leadership he did not provide. The Burns psychological breakdown. Burns' inability to break Homer's resistance creates psychological crisis for someone accustomed to complete dominance in labor relations. Burns cannot accept that an obvious fool is defeating him in negotiations, leading to escalating frustration and irrational responses. His breakdown demonstrates that power dynamics depend on shared understanding of how power operates, and when one party cannot recognize power relationships, those relationships lose their effectiveness. Burns's descent into rage and unreasonable behavior as the strike continues reveals the psychology of powerful individuals confronting unexpected resistance. His sense of natural dominance and worker subordination faces challenge from someone too stupid to accept subordinate position, creating cognitive dissonance that Burns cannot resolve. The fact that Homer defeats Burns not through superior strategy, but through superior ignorance, adds humiliation to Burns' loss, as he must acknowledge that he lost to someone unworthy of being considered an opponent. The resolution through incompetence. The strike ends when Burns capitulates and agrees to preserve the dental plan, unable to outlast a Union president too ignorant to recognize when he should surrender. Homer achieves the negotiation goal through persistence born of incomprehension rather than strategic calculation, succeeding where competent negotiators might have strategically compromised. This victory preserves dental coverage for all plant workers and their families, solving Lisa's immediate crisis and protecting hundreds of other families from similar situations. The resolution demonstrates that sometimes desirable outcomes can be achieved through incompetence, when that incompetence creates immunity to intimidation and manipulation. Homer's inability to understand power dynamics meant he could not be moved through threats that would have worked on someone capable of recognizing them as threats. This accidental advantage won negotiations that skill and intelligence might have lost through strategic capitulation to seemingly stronger opponents. The complete absence of understanding. Throughout the entire crisis, Homer never grasps what actually happened or his role in securing victory for the Union. He does not recognize that he successfully defended worker benefits through masterful negotiation. He does not understand that his incompetence functioned as strategy. He does not comprehend the broader labor implications of preserving dental coverage. Homer processes the entire incident as a confusing series of events that somehow ended with Lisa getting braces, missing completely that he became labor hero through accidental advocacy. This absence of understanding means Homer learns no lessons from the experience and develops no increased competence or consciousness about labor issues. The successful negotiation represents pure accident rather than growth or achievement, leaving Homer as ignorant about Union leadership after the crisis as he was before it. The disconnect between Homer's objective success and subjective incompetence creates a tragicomic situation where victory occurs without the victor understanding victory or being capable of replicating the success intentionally. The luck versus skill dynamic. The entire episode hinges on luck rather than skill determining the outcome of crucial labor negotiations. Homer's accidental success teaches nothing about effective Union leadership and provides no model for future negotiations. The workers' victory depends entirely on fortunate conjunction of Homer's incompetence creating immunity to intimidation, Burns' miscalculation of how to handle incompetent opponent, and external factors making settlement preferable to continued strike for both parties. This luck-based victory is both fortunate and dangerous. Fortunate because workers retain crucial benefits they might have lost under competent leadership that understood when to compromise. Dangerous because it reinforces the idea that incompetent leadership can produce good outcomes, potentially discouraging workers from demanding actually qualified representatives in future situations. The long-term implications of celebrating accidental success include reduced expectations for leadership competence and false lessons about what produces favorable outcomes in labor negotiations. Summary. In Last Exit to Springfield, Homer's accidental election as Union president during Mr. Burns' campaign to eliminate dental benefits puts every plant worker's health care at risk due to his complete incompetence in labor negotiation, inability to understand union dynamics, and focus solely on his personal concern about Lisa's braces, rather than broader implications for all families. His success in maintaining the dental plan occurs entirely through luck and misinterpreted stupidity rather than skill, strategy, or understanding, with Burns ultimately capitulating because negotiating with someone too ignorant to recognize intimidation tactics proves impossible. The episode reveals how Homer's incompetence can occasionally produce positive outcomes through sheer accident, but this success masks the genuine danger his ignorance poses when stakes involve hundreds of families' healthcare access and financial stability, with the victory teaching no lessons about effective union leadership and depending entirely on fortunate circumstances rather than repeatable competence. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Bart the Daredevil. Bart the Daredevil, when inadequate supervision, becomes near-fatal negligence. Homer's failure to prevent Bart from attempting a suicidal skateboard jump over Springfield Gorge, followed by his own catastrophic substitute jump that results in devastating repeated physical trauma, demonstrates how parental negligence and poor impulse control can lead directly to life-threatening situations that scar both parent and child permanently. The monster truck rally inspiration. Bart's fixation on dangerous stunts begins when Homer takes the family to a monster truck rally where they watch Captain Lance Murdoch perform death-defying stunts that leave the performer hospitalized with horrific injuries. Rather than recognizing these injuries as warnings about the dangers of stunt performance, Bart interprets Murdoch's willingness to risk death for audience entertainment as admirable courage and exciting career path. The rally plants the idea in Bart's mind that performing dangerous stunts makes someone special and worthy of attention. Homer's decision to expose Bart to this content reveals his characteristic lack of judgment about age-appropriate entertainment. A responsible parent might recognize that watching someone nearly die performing stunts could inspire dangerous imitation in impressionable children. Homer sees only the spectacle and entertainment value without considering how his son might process and respond to the content. This failure to anticipate how children internalize media messages they witness contributes directly to Bart's subsequent dangerous behavior, the escalating daredevil stunts. Following the monster truck rally, Bart begins performing increasingly dangerous stunts on his skateboard, starting with relatively minor risks like jumping over trash cans and progressing to more life-threatening feats. Each successful stunt reinforces Bart's belief that he possesses special abilities that protect him from the injuries that would befall ordinary people attempting similar acts. This escalation pattern is characteristic of risk-seeking behavior, where successful completion of dangerous acts produces adrenaline highs that drive progression toward even greater danger. Homer and Marge's response to Bart's escalating stunts reveals inadequate parenting supervision and failure to establish appropriate boundaries. They treat Bart's daredevil behavior as amusing quirk rather than recognizing it as genuine danger requiring intervention. Their amusement and encouragement of early stunts creates permissive environment that Bart interprets as approval for continuing and escalating his dangerous activities. By the time the danger becomes undeniable, Bart's behavior pattern is too established to interrupt easily. The announced gorge jump plan. Bart's stunts culminates in his public announcement that he will jump Springfield Gorge on his skateboard, a feat that would require impossibly precise execution to survive. The gorge represents a gap so vast that professional stunt performers, using specialized equipment, would consider the jump extremely dangerous. For a 10-year-old child on a skateboard to attempt this jump is not daredevil bravery, but effectively suicide, with survival depending entirely on luck rather than skill or preparation. Bart's public announcement of his intention to jump the gorge creates social pressure that makes backing down psychologically difficult. He has told friends, family, and community members about the planned stunt, building anticipation and creating audience expectations. This public commitment traps Bart into following through even if he develops second thoughts, as backing down would mean social embarrassment and loss of the daredevil identity he has cultivated. The public nature of the commitment transforms what could have been private change of mind into impossible surrender of social standing. The inadequate prevention attempts. Homer recognizes that Bart's gorge jump represents genuine mortal danger and attempts to prevent the stunt through various interventions, including lectures about safety, appeals to common sense, and eventually physical confiscation of Bart's skateboard. These prevention efforts fail because they address symptoms rather than underlying psychological needs driving Bart's behavior. Homer focuses on preventing the specific gorge jump rather than addressing why Bart seeks validation through dangerous stunts and helping him find safer ways to feel special and competent. The inadequacy of Homer's prevention reflects broader failure to understand child psychology and effective behavior change strategies. Simply forbidding dangerous behavior without providing alternative outlets for the needs that behavior fulfills rarely produces lasting change. Bart needs to feel brave, special, and capable of achieving difficult goals. The daredevil stunts fulfill those needs, so preventing stunts without offering alternative fulfillment sources just creates conflict without solving the underlying problem driving the behavior: the skateboard confiscation failure. Homer's decision to confiscate Bart's skateboard represents his attempt at parental authority and behavior control, but this intervention proves ineffective because Homer cannot maintain constant surveillance over a determined child. Bart simply locates and retrieves his skateboard, demonstrating that physical barriers to behavior only work when the person imposing barriers can maintain constant enforcement. Homer's failure to recognize this limitation of confiscation as strategy reveals his impulsive approach to parenting, where he implements first solution that occurs to him without considering whether that solution can actually be sustained. The skateboard retrieval also demonstrates Bart's determination to proceed with his jump despite his father's explicit prohibition. This defiance reveals that Bart values peer approval and his daredevil identity more than parental approval or obedience to authority. The fact that Bart is willing to defy his father and risk severe punishment to jump the gorge shows the depth of his commitment to the stunt and the inadequacy of parental prohibition as prevention strategy when children are this invested in. Forbidden behavior, the substitute jump decision. When Homer realizes Bart is proceeding with the gorge jump, despite all prevention efforts, he makes the impulsive decision to jump the gorge himself as a substitute, believing that his parental sacrifice will either prevent Bart from jumping or, at least, spare Bart from being the one injured. This decision reflects Homer's genuine love for his son and willingness to sacrifice himself for Bart's safety. However, the decision also demonstrates Homer's characteristic failure to think through consequences or consider alternative solutions before acting on emotional impulses. The sacrifice appears noble on surface, but actually represents terrible parenting decision based on several faulty assumptions. Homer assumes Bart will be satisfied with watching the jump performed by someone else, rather than doing it himself, ignoring that the entire point for Bart is proving his own courage and capability. Homer assumes his attempt at the jump will definitively demonstrate its danger and discourage future attempts, not recognizing that failed jumps might inspire Bart to try succeeding where his father failed. Most fundamentally, Homer assumes that modeling reckless, dangerous behavior to discourage reckless, dangerous behavior makes logical sense. The tragic miscalculation. Homer's preparation for jumping Springfield Gorge reveals his complete incompetence at stunt performance and absence of any planning or consideration of how to make the attempt even remotely survivable. He positions himself on the skateboard incorrectly, approaches the jump at improper speed, and fails to account for the ramp trajectory needed to clear the gorge. These failures stem from Homer's impulsive decision-making, where he commits to an action before considering how to execute that action, successfully or even competently. The miscalculations become apparent the moment Homer launches off the ramp, with his trajectory immediately wrong and his control of the skateboard non-existent. Rather than achieving the speed and angle needed to clear the gorge, Homer's launch barely gets him airborne before gravity begins pulling him down toward the rocky gorge floor far below. The mathematical certainty of his failure is visible from the moment he leaves the ramp, making what follows tragic but entirely predictable outcome of attempt made without adequate preparation or capability. The catastrophic fall sequence. Homer's fall into Springfield Gorge plays out as extended sequence of impacts against rocky walls and outcroppings as he plummets toward the bottom. Each impact produces visible injuries, with Homer's body bouncing off rocks, slamming into cliff faces, and tumbling uncontrollably downward. The duration and multiplicity of impacts emphasizes the severity of trauma being inflicted on Homer's body, with bones breaking, tissues tearing, and organs being damaged through repeated high-velocity collisions with immovable stone. The extended nature of the full sequence serves dark comedy through exaggeration, but also drives home the genuine consequences of what Homer has attempted. Unlike cartoon violence that produces instant recovery, this fall shows cumulative damage, adding up impact by impact until Homer reaches the bottom as a broken, barely alive mass of injuries. The realistic portrayal of injury consequences contrasts with typical cartoon physics to emphasize that some actions produce real harm that cannot be reversed or ignored through comedic reset. The ambulance accident repeat trauma. In a darkly comic twist, after Homer is loaded into an ambulance for transport to the hospital, the ambulance crashes on the way, causing Homer to fall out and roll back down the gorge, experiencing the entire traumatic fall sequence a second time. This repeat trauma compounds the already catastrophic injuries from the first fall, potentially doubling or tripling the damage to Homer's body. The accident demonstrates how single bad decisions can create cascading consequences, where one disaster leads to additional disasters beyond the original incident. The ambulance crash also serves as commentary on how suffering and trauma can feel arbitrary and excessive, piling consequences upon consequences without mercy or proportion. Homer's second fall through the gorge punishes him again for a single decision, as if the universe itself is emphasizing through repetition how foolish and dangerous his choice was. The cosmic unfairness of experiencing the same horrible fall twice drives home that some mistakes have consequences severe enough that one occurrence is already too many. The hospital scene aftermath. The hospital scene reveals the full extent of Homer's injuries through his heavily bandaged and broken body, hooked to various medical machines. His condition demonstrates that he suffered injuries across multiple body systems, including skeletal fractures, internal organ damage, severe lacerations, and likely traumatic brain injury from repeated head impacts. The medical equipment and full-body casting indicate that his recovery will require months of treatment, rehabilitation, and healing before he regains even basic functionality. The hospital aftermath also reveals the impact on the family of Homer's decision to sacrifice himself. Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie must cope with Homer's extended hospitalization and the uncertainty about whether he will recover fully or suffer permanent disabilities. Bart, in particular, must live with the knowledge that his determination to jump the gorge caused his father's near-death experience, creating guilt and responsibility that may scar him psychologically, regardless of whether Homer eventually recovers. Physically, the lack of supervision change, despite the catastrophic consequences of inadequate supervision and boundary setting that led to Bart's gorge jump plan, there's no indication that Homer and Marge implement meaningful changes to their parenting approach to prevent similar incidents. In the future, Homer's sacrifice demonstrates willingness to protect Bart from danger, but doesn't address the underlying supervision failures that allowed Bart's daredevil behavior to escalate to life-threatening levels. The episode concludes without establishing new family rules, supervision protocols, or boundaries that would prevent Bart from pursuing similar dangerous activities once the immediate crisis passes. This absence of systematic change means the family has learned no lasting lessons from the trauma, except that Homer will sacrifice himself for his children in emergencies. The underlying patterns of inadequate supervision, failure to anticipate dangerous situations, and inability to establish and enforce appropriate boundaries remain unchanged, setting the stage for future crises when Bart or the other children find new dangerous activities to pursue. The fact that catastrophic consequences do not produce meaningful behavior or system changes demonstrates the futility of learning through crisis when no framework exists for implementing lessons learned. The psychological impact on Bart. Bart's experience of watching his father nearly die attempting a stunt Bart had planned to perform himself creates complex psychological effects, including guilt about causing the accident, trauma from witnessing his father's broken body, and confusion about whether the incident represents proof that the jump was too dangerous or evidence that with better execution it could be successfully completed. These mixed messages and complicated emotions likely produce lasting impact on Bart's relationship with his father, his appetite for risk-taking, and his understanding of how his choices affect others. The trauma of watching Homer fall also forces Bart to confront mortality and consequence in ways that his previous successful stunts had shielded him from. Seeing his father's broken body makes real the dangers that Bart had intellectually known existed, but had never emotionally accepted as genuinely threatening. This forced confrontation with real-world consequences of dangerous behavior may reduce Bart's appetite for future daredevil stunts, but the lesson is taught through traumatic means that create their own psychological damage, requiring processing and healing. Summary: in Bart the Daredevil, Homer's inadequate supervision and failed intervention allow Bart to develop increasingly dangerous skateboard stunts, culminating in a planned jump over Springfield Gorge that would almost certainly result in death. Homer's last-minute decision to perform the jump himself, while preventing Bart's immediate suicide attempt, results in catastrophic injuries, including multiple fractures, head trauma, and massive internal damage when he falls the full depth of the gorge, bouncing off rocks repeatedly during descent. The darkly comic repeat fall, when the ambulance crashes on the way to the hospital, demonstrates how consequences can compound unexpectedly, with Homer's extended hospitalization serving as physical manifestation of his failure to provide appropriate guidance and boundaries for his risk-seeking son. The experience forces Bart to witness consequences of dangerous behavior through watching his father nearly die, teaching the lesson through trauma rather than effective parenting that could have prevented the entire crisis through proper supervision and boundary setting. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Lisa's sax. Lisa's sax, the repeated crushing of artistic potential. Across multiple episodes throughout the Simpsons run, Homer's pattern of destroying Lisa's saxophone reeds, interrupting her practice for trivial reasons, dismissing her exceptional musical talent, and prioritizing his own comfort over her artistic development demonstrates systematic suppression of a gifted child's potential through parental neglect and active sabotage. The origin story of the saxophone. The episode Lisa's Sax provides backstory for how Lisa acquired her instrument, revealing that Homer and Marge initially supported Lisa's musical interests when recognizing her unhappiness and need for emotional outlet during difficult kindergarten experiences. The saxophone purchase represented Homer and Marge's attempt to help Lisa find joy and self-expression during a period of developmental struggle. This origin story makes Homer's subsequent neglect and sabotage of Lisa's musical development particularly tragic, as it shows that he once understood how important music is to Lisa's emotional well-being and identity. The initial support that led to the saxophone purchase demonstrates that Homer possesses capacity to recognize and respond to his children's emotional needs when those needs are presented clearly and dramatically enough to penetrate his usual self-absorption. However, this capacity appears limited to crisis moments, with Homer unable to sustain the attention and investment required for long-term support of Lisa's development. Once the immediate kindergarten crisis passed and Lisa found stability through music, Homer apparently felt his parental duty was complete and saw no need to continue actively supporting her musical growth. The repeated reed destruction incidents. Throughout the series, multiple episodes show Homer destroying Lisa's saxophone reeds through carelessness, deliberate action, or using them for inappropriate purposes. Saxophone reeds are delicate pieces of cane that produce sound when air passes over them, and they must be carefully maintained and replaced regularly. Homer's destruction of Lisa's reeds forces her to play on damaged equipment that produces poor sound quality, or leaves her unable to practice at all while waiting for replacement reeds. The pattern of reed destruction reveals Homer's complete disregard for the tools Lisa needs for her artistic practice. He treats her reeds as insignificant pieces of wood rather than recognizing them as essential equipment for her musical expression. The fact that reed destruction recurs across multiple episodes demonstrates that Homer learns nothing from previous incidents about respecting Lisa's belongings or understanding the impact his carelessness has on her ability to pursue her passion. The practice interruption pattern. Homer regularly interrupts Lisa's saxophone practice to demand that she be quiet so he can sleep, watch television, or simply exist in peace without the sound of her music. These interruptions treat Lisa's need for practice time as less important than Homer's desire for silence or uninterrupted entertainment consumption. The frequency and casualness of these interruptions communicates that Homer views Lisa's musical development as optional hobby rather than serious artistic pursuit requiring dedicated time and space. The impact of constant interruptions extends beyond immediate loss of practice time to include psychological messages about the value of Lisa's artistic work. Each interruption tells Lisa that her music annoys others, that her needs for practice space are unreasonable, and that she should minimize her presence and creative expression to avoid bothering people. These messages undermine Lisa's confidence and sense of entitlement to pursue her talents, teaching her to apologize for and diminish her artistic ambitions, rather than expecting support and encouragement from her family. The dismissal of musical talent. When Homer does acknowledge Lisa's saxophone playing, his comments often minimize or dismiss her exceptional talent rather than celebrating it. He treats her accomplishments as unremarkable or frames her music as noise rather than recognizing the skill and dedication required to achieve her level of performance. This dismissive attitude denies Lisa the parental validation and recognition that children need to develop confidence in their abilities and maintain motivation for continued growth. The dismissal proves particularly damaging because Lisa's musical talent is genuinely exceptional, with her skills far exceeding what would be expected for her age and experience level. She deserves enthusiastic support and recognition from her parents for achievements that represent real excellence. Instead, she receives indifference or annoyance, teaching her that even exceptional performance will not earn acknowledgement or appreciation from the people whose approval she most desires. The competition with personal needs. Homer's interruptions of Lisa's practice typically occur because her music conflicts with his desire for television watching, sleeping, or other personal activities that could easily be scheduled around her practice time with minimal inconvenience. His unwillingness to make even slight adjustments to his routine to accommodate Lisa's needs demonstrates that he prioritizes trivial personal comfort over his daughter's artistic development. The implicit message is that Homer's leisure time matters more than Lisa's growth as a musician. This priority system reflects broader family dynamics, where Homer's needs and preferences take precedence over everyone else's, with other family members expected to accommodate his requirements, while he makes no reciprocal accommodations for them. Lisa's music practice represents one example of a larger pattern where Homer's convenience dictates family life, regardless of how this arrangement affects others' well-being or development. The children learn that their needs are secondary to Homer's wants, teaching them to suppress their own requirements and ambitions to avoid conflict with their father. The financial deprioritization. The family's limited financial resources could potentially be invested in higher quality saxophone, professional lessons, or opportunities for Lisa to perform and compete. However, Homer consistently chooses to spend disposable income on his own entertainment, hobbies, and immediate gratification rather than investing in Lisa's musical development. This pattern of financial choice demonstrates that Lisa's artistic growth is not valued enough to warrant even modest financial investment, despite the family having funds available for Homer's various pursuits. The lack of financial investment limits Lisa's musical development by restricting access to quality instruction, performance opportunities, and equipment that would help her reach her full potential. While Lisa achieves remarkable skill despite these limitations, she might reach even higher levels with proper support and investment. Homer's choice to prioritize his own immediate pleasure over his daughter's long-term development demonstrates short-sighted parenting that sacrifices children's futures for parents' present comfort. The lack of performance attendance. Lisa regularly participates in school recitals, competitions, and performances where students showcase their musical abilities for audiences including family members. Homer's attendance at these events is sporadic at best, with him frequently missing performances where Lisa hoped for parental support and recognition. When he does attend, he often arrives late, leaves early, or shows visible boredom and inattention that communicates his presence is obligatory rather than desired. The pattern of absence from Lisa's performances sends clear message that her achievements are not important enough to warrant Homer's time and attention. Each missed performance or half-hearted attendance reinforces Lisa's understanding that her musical accomplishments do not matter to her father, undermining her sense of worth and the meaning she finds in her artistic work. The contrast between Lisa's dedicated preparation and Homer's casual disregard demonstrates the asymmetry in their relationship, where she desperately seeks his approval, while he cannot be bothered to show interest in her achievements. The explicit sabotage incidents. Beyond passive neglect and carelessness, some episodes show Homer actively sabotaging Lisa's music through deliberate destruction of her instrument, interference with performance opportunities, or actions specifically designed to prevent her musical activities. This active sabotage crosses the line from neglect into abuse, with Homer taking explicit action to harm Lisa's artistic development rather than simply failing to support it adequately. The motivation for active sabotage appears to stem from Homer's resentment of how Lisa's music demands family resources, creates noise that annoys him, and represents intellectual artistic achievement that Homer cannot understand or match. Lisa's musical excellence highlights Homer's own mediocrity and lack of accomplishments, creating psychological discomfort that he resolves through undermining her success rather than celebrating it. This jealous undermining of his daughter's talents reveals profound insecurity and inability to take pride in his children's achievements when those achievements exceed his own capabilities. The psychological impact on confidence. The cumulative effect of repeated reed destruction, practice interruptions, dismissal of talent, and lack of support creates observable damage to Lisa's confidence about her musical abilities, despite objective evidence of her exceptional skill. She begins to doubt whether her music has value, whether she deserves to pursue her artistic ambitions, and whether she should continue investing time and emotional energy in an activity that her family treats as burden rather than blessing. This confidence damage manifests in Lisa's increasing apologetic approach to her music, where she prefaces practice sessions with apologies for potential noise and frames her need for practice time as unreasonable imposition rather than legitimate requirement for artistic development. The internalization of her family's negative messages transforms Lisa's relationship with her music from source of joy and pride to source of guilt and conflict, poisoning what should be purely positive aspect of her identity and self-expression. The broader pattern of intellectual dismissal. Homer's sabotage of Lisa's music represents one aspect of larger pattern where he dismisses, undermines, or actively opposes Lisa's intellectual and artistic pursuits across multiple domains. Her academic achievements receive similar lack of recognition or support. Her political activism is mocked or ignored. Her reading and writing are treated as pretentious rather than admirable. This comprehensive pattern of intellectual dismissal communicates that excellence in domains requiring intelligence or creativity will not earn parental approval or support. The consistent intellectual dismissal forces Lisa to choose between pursuing her talents and maintaining peaceful relationship with her father. The choice creates an untenable situation where developing her gifts means accepting ongoing conflict and disappointment from Homer's lack of support, while abandoning her pursuits might earn his approval but would require betraying her own identity and potential. Lisa's usual choice to continue pursuing excellence, despite opposition, shows remarkable resilience, but the psychological cost of this ongoing conflict damages her well-being regardless of her determination to persevere. The contrast with Bart's support. Homer's treatment of Lisa's musical development stands in stark contrast to his enthusiastic support for Bart's various interests, including skateboarding, pranks, and mischief. While Homer dismisses Lisa's saxophone practice as annoying noise, he encourages and participates in Bart's activities even when those activities are destructive or dangerous. This differential treatment communicates that Homer values certain types of behavior and achievement while devaluing others, with the valued behaviors coincidentally being those associated with traditional masculinity, while devalued behaviors require intellectual or artistic sophistication. The unequal treatment damages both children in different ways. Lisa learns that her gifts and interests are not valued by her father, undermining her confidence and sense of worth. Bart learns that his father rewards behavior that creates problems while failing to encourage development of positive qualities or abilities. The family dynamics teach problematic lessons about gender, intelligence, and what types of children deserve support and recognition from parents. Summary. In the pattern revealed through Lisa's sax and related episodes, Homer's repeated destruction of Lisa's saxophone reeds, constant interruption of her practice for trivial personal convenience, and systematic dismissal of her exceptional musical talent demonstrates how parental neglect can crush a gifted child's artistic development through both passive indifference and active sabotage. His prioritization of minor personal comfort, adjusting TV volume, sleeping undisturbed, avoiding financial investment in quality instruments, over Lisa's need for support and practice space, reveals a profound inability to recognize or nurture exceptional talent in his own child. The cumulative effect of missed performances, broken reeds, verbal dismissal, and complete absence of encouragement creates psychological damage that undermines Lisa's confidence and forces her to pursue musical excellence despite rather than because of her father's involvement, making her achievements remarkable for surviving his opposition rather than benefiting from his support. The broader pattern of intellectual dismissal across all domains of Lisa's life demonstrates that Homer's failure to support her music represents systematic devaluation of intelligence and artistic achievement, teaching Lisa that her gifts are burdens to be minimized rather than treasures to be celebrated and developed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the cartridge family. The cartridge family. When gun ownership becomes domestic terrorism. Homer's purchase of a handgun and subsequent reckless behavior, pointing it at family members, using it to perform household tasks, and creating an atmosphere of fear throughout the home, represents domestic violence through constant threat rather than direct assault, transforming the Simpson household into an environment where everyone lives in terror of accidental or intentional shooting. The initial home invasion fear. Homer's decision to purchase a gun stems from his fear following a riot in Springfield that threatened public safety. This initial motivation appears reasonable on surface, with Homer responding to legitimate safety concerns by seeking means to protect his family. However, Homer's approach to addressing these concerns through gun ownership demonstrates his characteristic impulsive decision-making, where he selects dramatic solutions without considering less dangerous alternatives or whether he possesses the responsibility and discipline necessary to safely handle firearms. The gun show acquisition. Rather than going through proper channels involving background checks and waiting periods, Homer purchases his handgun at a gun show where regulations are lax and immediate acquisition is possible. The ease with which Homer obtains a dangerous weapon despite having no training, no safety education, and obvious temperamental unsuitability for gun ownership reveals systematic failures in gun regulation. The episode depicts the gun show as chaotic marketplace where anyone with money can purchase firearms regardless of competence, stability, or intention. The immediate reckless behavior. Homer's gun ownership produces immediate dangerous behavior as he begins treating the firearm as a toy or tool for entertainment rather than weapon requiring extreme care and respect. Within hours of purchasing the gun, Homer is waving it around carelessly, pointing it in unsafe directions, and failing to follow basic safety protocols that responsible gun owners consider sacred. This immediate progression from acquisition to reckless use demonstrates that Homer never possessed any genuine understanding of or commitment to safe gun handling. The family members as targets. Perhaps most horrifying is Homer's pattern of pointing the loaded gun at family members, including Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. Whether done in jest, out of anger, or through simple carelessness, these instances of having a loaded weapon aimed at them create terror for family members who understand that Homer's poor impulse control could result in accidental or intentional shooting at any moment. Even if Homer claims to be joking, the presence of a real loaded gun transforms what might be harmless gesture into genuine death threat. The psychological atmosphere of fear. The gun's presence in the home creates permanent state of anxiety and hypervigilance for family members, who must now factor potential shooting into every interaction with Homer. They cannot predict when Homer might grab the gun, cannot trust his judgment about when it is appropriately used, and cannot feel safe in their own home, knowing that an armed, unstable person shares their living space. This atmospheric fear represents a form of psychological torture, where the threat is constant, even when not actively manifested. The dismissal of safety concerns. When Marge expresses her fear and discomfort about the gun's presence, Homer dismisses her concerns as overreaction or unnecessary worry. He insists that the gun is perfectly safe as long as he maintains control of it, failing to recognize that his own poor judgment and impulse control make his possession of firearms inherently dangerous. This dismissal of legitimate safety concerns represents gaslighting, where Homer reframes rational fear as irrational anxiety requiring correction rather than reasonable response to genuine threat. The escalation to problem-solving tool. Homer begins using his gun to solve minor household problems, including turning off lights, changing television channels, and opening containers. This treatment of firearms as general-purpose tools demonstrates complete failure to understand that guns are designed exclusively for one purpose and should never be used casually for routine tasks. Each discharge of the weapon in the house creates potential for ricochet injuries, property damage, and accidental shooting of family members. The ultimatum from Marge. Marge's tolerance for Homer's gun ownership reaches breaking point when the danger becomes too obvious to ignore or rationalize away. She issues an ultimatum, requiring Homer to choose between keeping his gun or keeping his family. This ultimatum represents Marge's recognition that she cannot protect her children while remaining in a home with armed, unstable person, and that preserving her marriage is not worth the risk of her children being shot accidentally or deliberately by their father. The deceptive disposal. Homer pretends to dispose of the gun to satisfy Marge's ultimatum while actually hiding it in various locations around the house. This deception represents fundamental betrayal of Marge's trust and explicit violation of the conditions she set for remaining in the marriage. Homer's willingness to lie about something this consequential demonstrates that he values gun ownership more than honesty with his wife, or respecting her reasonable boundaries about household safety. The discovery and final confrontation. When Marge discovers that Homer lied about disposing of the gun, the betrayal damages their relationship beyond the original gun ownership issue. Homer's deception proves he cannot be trusted to prioritize family safety over his own desires, forcing Marge to recognize that she cannot rely on Homer's word when he promises to protect the family from danger. The discovery creates crisis of trust that extends beyond guns to call into question whether Marge can ever trust Homer's promises about anything important. Summary. In the Cartridge family, Homer's gun ownership transforms the Simpson home into an environment of constant danger and psychological terror, with family members living in fear of his reckless handling and casual threat during every interaction. His pointing the weapon at Marge, Bart, and Lisa, even in jest or during moments of frustration, combined with using it to perform household tasks, turn off lights, and solve minor problems, demonstrates how firearms in the hands of impulsive, unstable, Individuals create domestic terrorism through ongoing threat rather than singular violent incident. Marge's ultimatum forcing Homer to choose between his gun and his family reveals the severity of danger she recognizes, while Homer's attempted deception about disposing of the weapon shows his willingness to prioritize gun ownership over his wife's. Reasonable safety concerns and explicit conditions for remaining in the marriage, creating betrayal of trust that damages their relationship as severely as the original danger. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to natural-born kisses. Natural-born kisses, when parental exhibitionism becomes family trauma. Homer and Marge's escalating pattern of public sexual behavior, culminating in them appearing completely naked on a windmill during a mini golf game while their children watch in horror, demonstrates how adult sexual gratification, pursued without consideration for children's psychological well-being, inflicts lasting developmental trauma on forced witnesses. The marital spark reignition attempt. Homer and Marge's public intimacy escalation begins when they recognize their marriage has fallen into routine lacking excitement and passion. Their decision to reignite romance through increasingly public sexual encounters stems from the thrill of risk and taboo violation rather than genuine intimacy or connection. This approach to marriage renewal demonstrates concerning willingness to prioritize temporary excitement over appropriate boundaries, particularly regarding locations where children might witness their activities. The pattern of increasingly public locations. Homer and Marge's risk-taking progresses from semi-private locations to increasingly public spaces where discovery becomes more likely and consequences more severe. This escalation pattern mirrors addiction dynamics, where initial thrill diminishes through repetition, requiring progressively extreme behavior to achieve the same excitement. The couple's focus on the adrenaline of potential discovery prevents them from considering the impact their behavior might have on people who witness it, particularly their own children. The balloon flight and stranding. The couple's exhibitionist adventure reaches crisis when they take a hot air balloon ride that goes awry, leaving them stranded far from home without clothing. This situation represents foreseeable consequence of reckless behavior pursued without adequate preparation or consideration of potential complications. The fact that their sexual adventurism creates emergency situation requiring them to walk naked through populated areas demonstrates how irresponsible pursuit of thrills can spiral into circumstances far more serious than initially intended. The naked walk through Springfield. Homer and Marge's naked walk through their hometown exposes them to public view in ways that damage their social standing and professional reputations. The public nudity constitutes crime in most jurisdictions, subjecting them to potential arrest and prosecution. More significantly, their exposure is witnessed by neighbors, co-workers, and community members who will forever associate Homer and Marge with this incident, creating lasting embarrassment and social consequence that extends far beyond the immediate event. The mini-golf windmill appearance. The crisis reaches its nadir when Homer and Marge, still naked and seeking cover, end up on display on a mini golf course windmill, where they are visible to crowds including their own children. This moment represents the ultimate failure of their judgment and the point where their sexual adventurism inflicts direct psychological damage on Bart, Lisa, and Maggie. The children's presence transforms the incident from private embarrassment into family trauma, requiring their children to witness them in sexually compromised position. The children witnessing. Bart and Lisa's horror at seeing their parents naked and exposed on the windmill represents age-appropriate response to forced witnessing of parental sexuality. Children need to maintain certain boundaries with their parents' sexuality to develop healthy attitudes about bodies, intimacy, and appropriate behavior. Forced witnessing of parental nudity in sexualized context violates these necessary boundaries and creates confusion about appropriate family relationships and sexual behavior. The psychological trauma to Bart and Lisa. The lasting impact of this incident on Bart and Lisa includes potential difficulty forming healthy attitudes about sexuality, bodies, and appropriate boundaries. They experienced violation of the parent-child boundary that should protect children from witnessing parental sexuality. This violation creates images and memories that cannot be erased and that may complicate their own sexual development as they mature. The trauma is compounded by the public nature of the exposure, with their parents' behavior witnessed by peers who will mock and tease them about the incident. The complete absence of parental consideration. Throughout their exhibitionist adventure, Homer and Marge never consider how their behavior might affect their children if discovered. Their focus remains entirely on their own thrill-seeking and sexual gratification, without apparent awareness that parents have responsibility to maintain appropriate boundaries for children's psychological well-being. This absence of consideration demonstrates failure of parental instinct and judgment that should automatically factor children's needs into adult decision-making. The lack of real accountability. The episode's resolution treats the incident as comedic adventure, with minimal lasting consequences, rather than recognizing the serious boundary violation and potential psychological harm inflicted on the children. Homer and Marge face no significant consequences for their public nudity or the trauma of exposing their children to sexualized parental behavior. This lack of accountability fails to provide any lesson or recognition that their pursuit of sexual excitement crossed important ethical lines regarding parental responsibility. Summary. In Natural Born Kissers, Homer and Marge's escalating pattern of public sexual behavior, driven by their desire to reignite marital passion through risk-taking, culminates in them appearing completely naked on a mini-golf windmill, while their children watch in horror, demonstrating how adult sexual gratification, pursued without consideration for children's psychological well-being, inflicts lasting developmental trauma on forced witnesses. The fact that Bart and Lisa must witness their parents' naked bodies on public display, while an entire crowd watches, represents a fundamental violation of appropriate parent-child boundaries that creates shame, embarrassment, and potential long-term psychological damage affecting their developing understanding of sexuality, bodies, and appropriate behavior. The episode's treatment of this exhibitionism as comedic adventure, rather than recognizing the serious boundary violations and trauma inflicted on children, reveals how easily media can normalize parental behavior that would be considered emotionally abusive in any serious psychological assessment of family dynamics and child well-being. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to one fish, two fish, blowfish, bluefish. One fish, two fish, blowfish, bluefish. 24 hours to confront lifetime of failure. When Homer believes he's been fatally poisoned by improperly prepared fugu, his desperate final day reveals the profound emptiness of his existence and his recognition of complete failure as father, husband, and human being, followed immediately by return to unchanged behavior patterns when he survives. The sushi restaurant and fugu preparation. Homer's brush with mortality begins when the Simpson family visits a sushi restaurant where Homer orders fugu, the Japanese delicacy made from blowfish that contains lethal poison if not prepared correctly. The chef who prepares Homer's fugu is inexperienced and likely cuts the fish improperly, contaminating Homer's meal with potentially fatal toxins. This situation results from Homer's characteristic impulsiveness in ordering dangerous food without understanding the risks or verifying the chef's qualifications. The diagnosis of likely death. After consuming the fugu, Homer experiences symptoms suggesting poisoning and visits Dr. Hibbert, who confirms that Homer has likely ingested fatal dose of blowfish toxin. Dr. Hibbert gives Homer approximately 24 hours to live before the poison causes complete system shutdown and death. This medical death sentence forces Homer to confront his mortality and the reality that his time for accomplishing anything meaningful has run out. The bucket list creation. Faced with 24 hours of remaining life, Homer creates a list of activities he wants to complete before dying. This list reveals the poverty of Homer's ambitions and the emptiness of his existence, as his final wishes include mundane activities that he could have done any day, but never prioritized. The list items represent things Homer always meant to do, but perpetually delayed, demonstrating how his life has been spent avoiding meaningful engagement rather than pursuing genuine growth or achievement. The attempted reconciliation with father. Homer's list includes making peace with his father Abe, acknowledging unresolved generational trauma and emotional distance that has characterized their relationship throughout Homer's life. The attempted reconciliation reveals that Homer recognizes his father's failures as parent, and how those failures shaped Homer's own inadequacies. But 24 hours provides insufficient time to process or heal decades of dysfunction and resentment. The superficial reconciliation represents Homer's desire for closure without actually doing the difficult work of genuine emotional healing, the private time with children. Homer spends time with Bart, Lisa, and Maggie, attempting to create final memories and impart wisdom before his death. However, Homer's limited wisdom and inability to articulate meaningful life lessons means these interactions provide more comfort for Homer than value for his children. He wants the satisfaction of feeling he has been a good father without confronting the reality that his parenting has been consistently inadequate and self-centered throughout their lives. The final evening with Marge. Homer's last night alive is supposed to be spent with Marge in intimate connection, cherishing their final hours together. However, Homer falls asleep while listening to the Bible on tape, wasting his precious remaining time on unconsciousness rather than genuine intimacy with his wife. This failure to prioritize his wife, even during his final hours, demonstrates how deeply ingrained his self-centered patterns are, and how incapable he is of genuine connection even when facing death. The falling asleep instead of cherishing time. Homer's choice to sleep rather than stay awake with Marge represents his characteristic avoidance of emotional intensity and preference for comfort over meaningful experience. Even with death approaching, Homer cannot maintain focus on what should be most important, instead retreating into unconsciousness to avoid the emotional weight of his final night. This pattern of avoidance has characterized his entire life and persists until his last conscious moments. The survival and return to normal. When Homer wakes the next morning still alive, he realizes that he either never consumed fatal dose or his body successfully metabolized the toxin overnight. The survival provides Homer with miraculous second chance at life, an opportunity to implement all the lessons learned during his confrontation with mortality. However, Homer's behavior immediately returns to his previous patterns without any lasting change or growth from the experience. The complete absence of lasting change. Despite experiencing what he believed was his final day and confronting the emptiness of his existence, Homer implements no meaningful changes to his behavior, priorities, or approach to life. He does not spend more time with his children, does not prioritize his marriage, does not pursue delayed dreams or goals. The experience that should have transformed his perspective and motivated significant life changes instead, produces zero lasting impact on his daily choices or long-term priorities. Summary. In One Fish, Two Fish, Blowfish, Bluefish, Homer's belief that he has 24 hours to live forces him to confront the emptiness of his existence and his profound failures as father, husband, and human being. With his desperate final day attempts to reconcile relationships and fulfill dreams, revealing how completely he has wasted his life, pursuing nothing meaningful or lasting. His bucket list, filled with simple pleasures and basic family connections, he should have prioritized all along rather than treating as deathbed achievements, demonstrates the tragedy of waiting until facing death to recognize what matters in life. The episode's conclusion, where Homer survives and immediately returns to his previous patterns without implementing any lessons learned from his mortality confrontation, shows his fundamental incapacity for genuine change, even when given explicit awareness of his failures and a miraculous second chance to correct them, proving that self-knowledge without will to change produces no growth or improvement in character or behaviour. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Alone Again, Natura Diddly. Alone Again, Natura Diddly, when Homer's selfishness becomes fatal. At a Springfield Speedway promotional event, Homer's demand for free t-shirts directly causes Maud Flanders' death when she's knocked off the grandstand by t-shirt cannons, demonstrating how his self-centered behavior and refusal to follow basics instructions can result in fatal consequences for innocent people who happen to be near him. The racing event setup. The Springfield Speedway hosts a promotional event where attendees can receive free t-shirts shot from pneumatic cannons into the crowd. This type of promotional activity is designed to generate excitement and give fans souvenirs, with the t-shirt launch typically aimed at willing participants who are prepared to catch flying merchandise. The event should be harmless entertainment, but Homer's behavior transforms it into fatal accident scene through his greedy insistence on receiving merchandise, regardless of safety protocols or consideration for others. Homer's demanding behavior. Throughout the event, Homer fixates on acquiring as many free t-shirts as possible, treating the promotional giveaway as opportunity for personal gain rather than shared entertainment for all attendees. His aggressive pursuit of t-shirts includes demanding that staff aim cannons at his location, standing up to make himself more visible as target, and prioritizing t-shirt acquisition over awareness of his surroundings and other people's safety. This single-minded greed represents Homer's characteristic inability to consider how his behavior affects others or to moderate his desires in service of broader social good. The specific sequence causing death. The fatal moment occurs when Homer stands up and bends over to catch t-shirts being launched from cannons, creating a situation where Maud Flanders, sitting behind Homer, is in the direct line of fire from the t-shirt cannons. When the cannons fire, the t-shirts hit Maud instead of Homer, with sufficient force to knock her backward off the elevated grandstand seating. The fall from significant height results in fatal injuries, with Maud dying from the impact of hitting the ground below the stands. Maud's fatal fall. The specific injuries that cause Maud's death are not detailed explicitly, but falling from elevated grandstand seating onto hard ground would likely cause catastrophic head trauma, spinal injuries, or internal organ damage incompatible with life. The fact that death results from what appears to be simple fall emphasizes how easily Homer's thoughtless behavior can produce irreversible consequences. Maud's death is not quick or painless tragedy, but rather preventable accident caused entirely by Homer's selfish insistence on positioning himself as target for flying objects without consideration for who might be behind him. The immediate aftermath. Homer's response to Maud's fatal fall reveals his characteristic inability to recognize his role in tragedies he causes. Rather than immediately acknowledging that his standing and bending created the conditions for Maud to be hit by projectiles, Homer appears confused about what happened and why Maud fell. This confusion stems from Homer's self-centered worldview, where his own actions and their consequences on others simply do not register as connected events requiring his accountability or remorse. The lack of accountability, acceptance. Throughout the aftermath of Maud's death, Homer never fully accepts or acknowledges his responsibility for causing the fatal accident. He may feel general sadness about Maud's death as a tragic event, but he does not connect his specific choices about standing and positioning himself with the direct causal chain that led to her being hit and falling. This failure to accept accountability means Homer learns no lessons from the incident and maintains his pattern of selfish behavior that prioritizes his desires over others' safety. The impact on Flanders' family. Maud's death leaves Ned Flanders a widower and leaves Rod and Todd motherless, creating devastating loss for a family that never harmed anyone and whose only misfortune was living next to Homer Simpson. The boys must grow up without maternal influence during crucial developmental years, while Ned must navigate single parenthood while processing his own grief. The Flanders family's tragedy stems entirely from being in wrong place at wrong time, while Homer pursued free t-shirts with characteristic disregard for consequences. The long-term consequences. Homer continues living next door to the family he destroyed, seeing daily the children he made motherless and the widower he created through his thoughtless behavior. This ongoing proximity should create constant reminder of the consequences his selfishness can produce, forcing Homer to confront the permanent damage his temporary greed caused to innocent neighbors. However, Homer's emotional shallowness and capacity for compartmentalization likely prevent this daily contact from producing the sustained guilt and behavioral change that such constant reminder should generate. The pattern of dangerous selfishness. Maud's death represents extreme example of broader pattern where Homer's self-centered behavior creates danger for people around him without his awareness or concern. His unwillingness to consider how his actions affect others means that he repeatedly creates hazardous situations where innocent people suffer consequences of his thoughtlessness. The fact that this pattern eventually produces fatal outcome demonstrates that Homer's character flaws are not merely annoying quirks, but genuine danger to public safety. Summary. In Alone Again, Natura Diddley, Homer's greedy insistence on receiving free t-shirts at a racing event directly causes Maud Flanders' death, when his demand that she stand up and then sudden movement to catch merchandise results in her being hit by t-shirt cannons and knocked off the grandstand to her death on the ground below. His complete inability to accept responsibility for his role in this tragedy, despite the clear causal chain from his selfish behavior to her fatal fall, demonstrates how his self-centered worldview prevents him from recognizing how his actions destroy others' lives and inflicts permanent damage on innocent people. The fact that Homer continues living next door to Ned and his devastated children, seeing daily the family he destroyed through his greedy thoughtlessness about free t-shirts without genuine remorse or lasting behavior change, reveals a profound moral vacancy where conscience and accountability should reside, leaving the Flanders family to rebuild their shattered lives while Homer experiences no meaningful consequences for causing a preventable death through his characteristic refusal to consider how his actions affect others. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. These 3 hours of Homer's darkest moments reveal a character whose incompetence, selfishness, and violence create lasting damage to everyone around him, from the children he strangles to the neighbors he destroys through oblivious privilege.